Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The first drop of rain fell so quietly, so softly, it could almost be dismissed as a trick of the mind. But then another drop landed, and then another. As the rain gradually built, so did the sound, like 1,000 whispers carried on the wind. The backpackers, weary from their hike, didn't yet see it coming. The storm, the Bitterroot Mountains, unforgiving and vast, hid their secrets well. The air had thickened all afternoon, and a strange unease settled over them as they hiked deeper into the forest. Jenna, a seasoned hiker, was the first to notice the faint chill in the air. She paused, looking up at the overcast sky. Dark clouds swirled in patterns that seemed unnatural, though she couldn't explain why. "Do you feel that?" she asked quietly, her voice barely rising above the rustle of wind through the trees. Luke, the most carefree of the group, waved her off with a dismissive chuckle. "It's just a little rain. We'll be fine." But even Luke, with his casual attitude, couldn't shake the way the trees felt. Wrong. The way the wind howled too fiercely for the season, twisting and turning as if it were alive. He wiped his brow nervously as the others pressed forward. The trail was slick with mud, and the world around them seemed to close in with each step. It wasn't long before the rain came harder, pounding the earth with an urgency that wasn't typical of a summer storm. The sky seemed to crack open as though some great beast was raging above them, shaking the heavens. "Let's find cover," Mark suggested, his voice low and anxious. They scrambled through the dense foliage, stumbling upon a rock overhang that jutted out from the side of a jagged cliff. It wasn't the shelter they had hoped for, but it would do. They huddled under the overhang, trying to avoid the worst of the storm. The sound of the rain hitting the earth was deafening, but amidst it, they began to hear something else. Something faint but undeniable. Whispers. At first, they thought it was just the wind howling through the branches and stones. But the voices, they didn't sound like the wind. No, they were something else. Human, perhaps, or something pretending to be. The whispers wove in and out of the downpour, like a chorus of muted voices, blending into the storm until it was impossible to tell one from the other. "Did you hear that? You hear?" Jenna asked, her eyes scanning the others. Mark looked at her with confusion. "Hear what?" "Voices," she said. "It sounds like someone is speaking, but I can't make out the words." Luke laughed, shaking his head. "You're hearing things. It's the storm, just the storm, that's all." But even Luke's voice had a nervous tremor to it. His usual bravado had faltered. The rain was thick, blurring the edges of the world, and the darkness wrapped itself tighter around them as the voices grew louder. "Did you hear that?" This time it was Mark who spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. The others froze, suddenly aware of the same unsettling sensation. The whispers had grown clearer, not distinct but familiar, as if they knew them. The sound threaded through the deafening storm, carrying with it something more than just the wind. It carried names. Luke. It was soft, as though someone was standing just behind him, calling his name with a tenderness that made his blood run cold. Jenna. Then Mark. Jenna. All their names, spoken in a voice that carried a knowing weight, a weight that grew heavier with each passing second, and then came the voice that none of them could ignore. "Luke." This time, it was different. The tone was familiar, as if it were a voice Luke had known for years. His heart clenched. and his mind struggled to place it. The name fell from his lips in a whisper of disbelief. Is that... But before he could finish the thought, a cold wind swirled in from the trees, and the rain seemed to pour harder, as though the heavens themselves were trying to drown out the voices. "Have to go," Luke muttered, his voice distant, as if drawn away by an invisible force. "I know that voice. I have to go." Before anyone could stop him, Luke stood up and walked toward the trees, a dazed look in his eyes. He didn't seem to care about the rain or the thunder anymore. He was fixated on the sounds calling him from the forest. "Luke, no, it's not." "Real!" Jenna cried out, rushing after him. But Luke didn't respond. The storm continued its wrath, and the earth beneath their feet seemed to shift in response to the forces at work around them. They followed, their feet slipping in the mud, the sound of the storm deafening in their ears. The further they ventured into the trees, the more intense the voices became, clearer, more urgent. They could hear words now, though they still didn't make sense. They felt as if they were beckoning them into a place far beyond the realm of understanding. When they caught up to Luke, he was standing still beneath the thick canopy of trees, staring up at something that wasn't there. His eyes were wide, vacant. His body didn't move even as the storm lashed around him. "Luke!" Jenna called, but there was no response. Not a flinch. Not even a blink. They surrounded him, trying to break him out of whatever trance had seized him. Mark shook him by the shoulders. "Come on, man! Snap out of it!" Luke's mouth opened, but the words that came out weren't his. They were garbled, strange, foreign. The sounds, impossible to place, as though they came from deep within the earth, from the cracks between worlds. "It knows we're here," Luke whispered, his voice chillingly distant, yet still undeniably his. Jenna froze. That wasn't Luke's voice. That wasn't the same person standing before them. It was something else entirely. "What the hell is happening?" Mark muttered, a deep sense of fear settling in the pit of his stomach. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get out of the woods and never look back. But they couldn't leave Luke like this. Not when the rain still whispered through the trees, the storm still howling above them. They managed to pull him back, gently but firmly, toward the shelter of the rock overhang. Luke seemed to snap out of it briefly, blinking rapidly, as if waking from a nightmare. "What's going on? What happened?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion. But the others were too unsettled to offer any answers. The storm raged on, the rain now accompanied by a faint rumbling in the earth, as though the land itself was groaning in warning. The voices, though quieter now, still lingered in the air, wrapping around them like a shroud. Mark's voice trembled as he glanced back toward the trees. "What did you hear, Luke? What did you see?" But Luke, now shaking, couldn't answer. He couldn't explain what had happened to him, only that he felt the pull. Something had drawn him in, called to him, and it wasn't human. It wasn't right. As they sat beneath the overhang, the world outside seemed to close in. The rain continued to pour, now more erratic, the thunder crashing louder as if something unseen was rising. But the whispers never stopped. The night was long, darker than it should have been, as though the storm had stolen the very light of the moon. They huddled under the rock overhang, drenched to the bone, their skin cold and clammy. But despite the physical discomfort, it was the chilling uncertainty that gripped them all. Luke had fallen silent, his hands trembling as he stared blankly ahead. It was as if whatever had overtaken him earlier had taken something from him, a piece of himself that was now lost. He couldn't shake the feeling that the air around him was different now, charged with an unnatural energy. Even in the safety of their shelter, the presence of something unseen loomed. "I don't know what's happening," Luke whispered, his voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. His words were fragmented, as if his thoughts were scattered. It's something in the trees. I felt it. It felt like it was waiting for me. Jenna sat beside him, trying to comfort him, though her own fear gnawed at her insides. She had seen that vacant look in his eyes, the way he'd stared at the trees as if hypnotized. That wasn't Luke. Something else had been there. Something that wanted him. Something that knew him. "Maybe we should stay here until the storm passes," Mark suggested, his voice heavy with fatigue and concern. "We'll be all right. We just need to wait this out." But even as he spoke, Mark's words seemed hollow. The storm wasn't just weather, it was a presence, an entity in itself. He could feel it pushing against them, a weight that pressed down on the air, on their very souls. "No," Luke replied, his voice shaking, his eyes wide with fear. "It's not the storm, it's—" But he stopped mid-sentence, eyes darting to the dark forest beyond the rock face. The whispering had returned, not as soft and distant as before, but louder now, as if the voices were standing just beyond the tree line, waiting. "It knows we're here," Luke repeated, as if the words were slipping from his mouth without his control. "It wants us to leave." Mark shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around him. "What do you mean, Luke? Who is it?" But Luke didn't answer. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the shadows beyond the overhang, as if the very trees themselves were watching him, waiting for him to step into their darkness. "I think we need to leave," Jenna said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound calm. "We can't stay here. It's getting worse, the storm, the whispers. We need to get out before it's too late." But as she spoke, something shifted. The rain, which had been pounding relentlessly just moments before, began to taper off. But it didn't stop. No, it slowed, only to pick up again in irregular bursts, violent, sporadic, as if the heavens themselves were shifting erratically, changing their rhythm. Then the thunder struck, louder this time. The entire earth seemed to tremble beneath their feet. The air vibrated with a low, resonant hum, and they could feel it in their bones, like the sky itself was in agony. "Something's wrong," Mark said, looking around nervously. "This isn't just a storm anymore." "It's not just the storm," Luke whispered, his voice low and strained. "It's watching us." And that was when they heard it, the crackle of movement in the trees. Not the wind this time, not the rain. Something was moving through the brush, slow and deliberate but unseen, a presence that pressed against them from all sides. Suddenly, the quietness of the forest became deafening. The whispers, no longer faint, echoed through the air in chaotic bursts. The voices were angry now, filled with a hunger that seemed to rise with each passing moment. The sound was coming from all directions, and it felt as though the trees themselves were speaking, calling them, beckoning them forward into the storm. Jenna stood up abruptly, her knees weak. "We have to go now. Now." But as soon as the words left her lips, a piercing sound filled the air, a high-pitched screech that made their ears ring and their skin crawl. It came from above, from deep within the forest, where the trees were thick and dense. Someone was shrieking in anguish. Luke snapped his head around, his face contorting with terror. That's not human," he gasped. The others turned to follow his gaze, but all they could see were shadows, moving unnaturally fast beneath the thick canopy. Shapes, figures. They shifted too quickly to be human, too fluid to be real. "I'm not going out there," Mark muttered, backing away from the edge of the overhang. His breath came in short bursts, his chest tightening as if the very air around them was closing in. But before they could make another move, the ground beneath them trembled. The wind picked up once again, fierce and unrelenting, pushing them all to the ground. And then, just as quickly as it had started, Everything fell silent. It was too quiet. The silence was worse than the storm. And that was when it happened. A figure emerged from the trees, stepping out of the darkness with a deliberate slowness. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything they had ever seen. It was a tall, gaunt shape, its body thin and elongated, its skin pale and slick like waterlogged bark. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, faint but terrifying, like twin lanterns flickering in the shadows. The air grew colder, and the whispers, they were louder now, unmistakable. They had become words. "You shouldn't have come," the voice said, rasping, echoing with the sound of centuries of pain. The figure stood still, its head tilted, watching them with those hollow eyes. And in that moment, they realized something horrific. It wasn't just Luke who had been called. They had all been called. The storm had come for them. And now they had to face what had been waiting for them in the dark. Jenna felt her heart hammering in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something that tied her to this place, to this moment. The figure wasn't just a creature. It was part of the mountain, part of the storm. And somehow, it knew them. It knew her. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling, her throat dry. The figure remained silent, the whispers in the air growing louder, more frantic. There was no answer. Instead, the figure raised its arm slowly, pointing toward the trees behind them. And just as they turned to look, they saw it. A second figure emerging from the shadows, and another, and another. The forest was alive with them, each one emerging from the dark, each one taller, gaunter, with eyes that glowed with that same terrible light. The whispers grew louder, but this time they were no longer just words. They were voices, screaming, begging, and in the distance the faintest sound of something far worse, something older, could be heard. A low, rumbling growl, like the earth itself had begun to stir beneath them. The shadows closed in. The figures from the trees emerged, moving with an unnatural grace, their bodies stretching too long, their limbs bending at odd angles. Their eyes gleamed faintly in the darkness, pools of pale light that flickered and swayed like dying stars. The whispers that had once been carried on the wind now rose into a cacophony of sound, a chorus of distant voices that seemed to echo from the deepest parts of the earth. Luke, still trembling, could barely tear his gaze away from the horrors before him. His body felt frozen, as if the storm itself had laced through his veins, locking him in place. "They're coming for us," Luke whispered, his voice hollow, as if part of him had already been claimed by the forest. His eyes glazed over again, and for a moment he seemed to vanish into himself, lost to whatever force had taken hold of him earlier. "Luke, snap out of it!" Jenna cried, her heart pounding in her chest. The urge to flee was overwhelming, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. She couldn't move. They couldn't move. The figures stepped closer, their ragged breaths joining the whispering voices in the air. There were more of them now, too many to count. They were everywhere, filling the spaces between the trees, rising from the earth itself, emerging from the darkness. They seemed to follow the rhythm of the storm, synchronized in their eerie movements, their forms flickering in and out of focus like reflections in a shattered mirror. Jenna could feel their eyes on her, a pressure building in her skull as if they were searching through her thoughts, tearing at her memories. Her pulse quickened. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and yet she couldn't look away. There was something deeply hypnotic about their movements, like they were drawing her in, luring her toward the forest. Then, from the back of the group, Mark finally broke free of his paralysis. His body jerked as if he were waking from a deep sleep, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to leave, now!" he shouted, his voice cracking. He didn't wait for anyone to respond. With a sharp turn, he sprinted toward the edge of the overhang, but the figures did not let him go. As Mark ran, the forest itself seemed to reach out, its limbs, branches and vines whipping toward him like living tendrils. They weren't just trees. No, this was something else, something older. The ground trembled once again, a deep, pulsing vibration beneath their feet. A sound, not thunder this time, but a growl, low and menacing, rumbled from deep within the forest. The figures didn't move, but the air around them thickened, became heavier with each passing moment. Jenna's voice broke through the suffocating silence. "Mark, come back!" But Mark didn't respond. He didn't even turn around. Then, as if the forest itself had made its choice, the first figure moved. It was fast, faster than anything they had seen before. The creature lunged with a speed that defied nature, its long skeletal limbs twisting impossibly. It reached out, fingers as sharp as the dead branches it had come from. Mark screamed once, an agonized, guttural cry, before the figure's hand closed around his throat, yanking him backward into the shadows of the trees. Jenna's heart stopped. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The air was thick with something oppressive, as if the storm had woven itself into every breath they took. The figure, holding Mark by his throat, raised him into the air. His body went limp, in its grasp, his feet dangling helplessly. Then, with a sickening jerk, the creature twisted, breaking Mark's neck with a sound that rang through the night like a snap of dry twigs. Jenna stumbled back, eyes wide, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She couldn't look away. It wasn't just the violence, it was the way the creature held him, the way it moved so deliberately, as though it was savoring every second of his life draining away. And then, as Mark's body went slack in the creature's grip, the figure dropped him onto the ground like a rag doll. He hit the dirt with a sickening thud, and for a moment, Jenna thought she saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of recognition. The figure that had killed him stood for a long moment, unmoving, its glowing eyes fixed on the group. And then, it spoke. It was a voice like the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, ancient, broken, yet filled with malevolent clarity. "You are not meant to leave." The words hung in the air, impossibly clear despite the storm's cacophony. Jenna couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her brain was drowning in a sea of terror, and it felt as if the storm itself were closing in on her, threatening to swallow her whole. She looked at Luke, but his face was no longer his own. His eyes were clouded, distant, as if whatever force had taken him before had returned to claim him once more. "We need to leave," Jenna breathed, the words tumbling from her lips in desperation. "We need to run, now!" But as she turned to flee, she heard the unmistakable sound of the forest moving again. The same deep, rumbling growl. It was closer now, closer than it had ever been. She didn't need to look back to know what was behind her. The ground shook once more, a wave of pressure surging through her chest. And then the thunder rolled again, this time with such intensity that it seemed to rattle her bones. But it wasn't just the thunder. It was the sound of something else, something worse, a deep, guttural sound that made the very air tremble. The trees were moving. The forest wasn't just alive. It was alive, and they were inside it, trapped in its grasp. Jenna could feel it now. The storm was no longer just a natural occurrence. It was alive, an entity with power that reached through the very fabric of the land. Something ancient and malevolent had awakened in the depths of the Bitterroot Mountains, and it was not going to let them leave. And then a horrific realization hit her like a physical blow. The storm, the whispers, the creatures, they weren't just tormenting them. They were waiting for them to understand, waiting for them to come to the horrifying truth. The storm had never been a mere weather phenomenon. It was the manifestation of something far worse, something that had always been. Here, buried deep beneath the earth, something that had never meant to let them leave. The darkness seemed to breathe with them. Jenna stumbled backward, the rain now a steady torrent against her skin, soaking through her clothes, yet the chill wasn't the worst of it. It was the presence, an oppressive weight in the air, the constant thrumming of something ancient beneath the storm. Her heart thudded in her chest, the rhythm erratic, wild, as though it too was struggling to survive. The figure that had taken Mark's life now stood motionless in the clearing, its eyes glowing faintly, locked onto the group. It was waiting, as if savoring their terror, watching them for signs of weakness. But it wasn't just that figure anymore. Jenna felt the other presences lurking in the dark, just beyond the reach of her vision, the way the storm itself seemed to be alive, breathing, pulling at the air. She couldn't think clearly. Her mind was a labyrinth of thoughts, swirling, tangled. But there was one thing she knew. This was no storm. This wasn't just the weather. The storm, the shadows, the whispers, they were all connected to something older, something far more dangerous. "We need to get out of here," Jenna said, her voice cracking as she spoke, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "We can't stay. It's too late. We've already seen too much." But there was no escaping it. The creature that had killed Mark was no longer alone. As Jenna looked around, more figures emerged from the dark trees, their movements unnervingly fluid, as if the storm itself were pulling them into existence. Each one was a twisted mockery of a person, a grotesque, elongated form that defied the natural order. They didn't walk. They swayed in and out of sight like mirages, their limbs stretching unnaturally, their eyes the only constant, glowing faintly in the endless night. Luke, still trembling, was muttering incoherently under his breath. "It's not real. None of this is real." His voice was far away, distant. His body swayed, and Jenna saw it now. His eyes were blank, his pupils wide and dilated, the same vacant expression from before. "Luke!" she cried, reaching out to him. But he didn't respond. He was slipping, falling back into that trance-like state, his mind consumed by the voices and the pull of whatever force was at work here. The group had been drawn into the heart of the storm, and it was clear now that they weren't just trapped physically. They were being twisted, their very minds and souls slowly slipping into the storm's grasp. Jenna felt the pull too, a growing dread gnawing at her mind, whispering in her ears. "It's too late. They won't let you leave. They never wanted you to leave." The figure closest to her stepped forward, its long, spindly fingers outstretched. She could hear its breath, ragged and heavy, as if it was struggling to remain solid, to keep itself anchored in the world they knew. The stench of decay mixed with the thick, humid air, a sickening combination of rot and damp earth. Jenna's chest tightened, and she had to fight not to scream. The figure's eyes glowed brighter now, a cruel, inhuman light that seemed to penetrate her very soul. "You are part of this now," the figure rasped, its voice a dry whisper that made Jenna's skin crawl. "We have waited for so long." A violent flash of lightning lit up the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the trees like twisted fingers reaching for them. It illuminated something behind the creature, a massive ancient stone archway, barely visible through the storm. Jenna hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to loom over them, its presence impossibly large, out of place. It was as though it had always been there, hidden in the folds of the forest, waiting for the right moment to emerge. "You cannot escape the heart of the storm," the figure continued, its voice growing colder. "The mountain calls. The storm is a door, and you are its key." The words sank deep into Jenna's mind, twisting her thoughts. A door? A key? What did it mean? Her pulse quickened, her heart pounding in her chest as she looked frantically at the others. Mark's lifeless body was still lying on the ground, but she couldn't focus on it. Not now. They needed to run. She needed to wake up from this nightmare. But with every step she took toward the trees, it felt as if the storm was closing in on her. "Come on, Luke," she said, desperately shaking him. "We have to go. You're not yourself. You're still in there. Fight it." But Luke didn't respond. He stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the stone archway in the distance. His lips moved, forming words that Jenna couldn't quite hear. His face was pale, his body trembling as though it was struggling against something invisible yet powerful. The other figures continued to move toward them, circling around like wolves, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jenna could feel their presence grow stronger with every passing second, the storm intensifying to a deafening roar. And then it hit her. The storm wasn't just a storm. It was a sacrifice, a pact made long ago, buried deep beneath the earth, hidden within the mountain, something ancient, something that fed on the souls of those who wandered too close to its heart. She felt it now, a gnawing hunger in the very air, in the trees, in the whispers. They wanted them. They were never meant to leave. The stone archway was no longer just a strange relic of the past. It was the storm's true face. The storm was alive, and the archway was the door to whatever it had been waiting for. And Luke was its chosen one, its vessel. He was the key to unlocking whatever slept beneath the mountain. Jenna felt her legs weaken, her strength draining away with every passing moment. She could hear her breath, shallow and frantic, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The figures closed in, surrounding her, their eyes bright with malice, their bodies swaying in rhythm with the wind. The storm's growl deepened, rumbling from the very core of the mountain, and Jenna understood now, with horrifying clarity, what they had all unwittingly walked into. The storm was not a natural disaster. It was the physical manifestation of an ancient force, a darkness that had slumbered beneath the earth for centuries, and it had chosen them as its prey. There was no escape. The figures were almost upon them. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. And Luke, his eyes locked on the stone archway, finally spoke in that hollow, foreign voice. "It's time. It's..." The figures circled closer, their movements growing more deliberate. The storm raged harder now, the wind screeching like the wail of a dying animal, the rain drenching their clothes and skin. Jenna could feel the wetness seeping into her bones, but it wasn't just the cold that made her shiver. It was the overwhelming sense that time was slipping away. Time and reality itself bending, warping around the mountain's dark heart. The stone archway beckoned them with a terrible pull, like a giant maw waiting to swallow them whole. She glanced at Luke, but his face was no longer his own. His once vibrant eyes were now dull and empty, as if his soul had already been claimed. His mouth moved, forming words, but the voice that emerged was not his. It was the voice of something ancient, something that had always been here. "We are its offspring now," Luke said, his voice hollow, his body shaking. You were chosen." Jenna felt her stomach twist, the words digging into her soul like jagged blades. Chosen? What did that mean? What was he trying to say? The figures around them moved with unsettling fluidity, and as the storm cracked, open above them, Jenna felt the ground beneath her feet tremble. The earth groaned, a deep guttural sound that seemed to rise from the very core of the mountain. Something inside the earth was waking up. "Luke, fight it!" she screamed, desperation clawing at her throat. She grabbed his arm, but he didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to feel her touch. His eyes, however, were locked on the stone archway. It was as though that was all he could see now, as though the mountain had claimed him entirely. The figure closest to them stepped forward. Its form twisted unnaturally in the rain, the shadows clinging to its long, gangly limbs like dark, wet rags. The creature's face was a mask of ancient sorrow, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its eyes pools of pale light that seemed to consume everything in their gaze. "She will not listen," the creature whispered, its voice like dry leaves, scraping against stone. "She cannot leave. None of you will leave." Jenna's heart raced. She backed away from the creature, only to find herself staring into the glowing eyes of another, and another. They were surrounded, their forms rising. From the trees like wraiths, their movements too smooth, too unnatural. The air thickened, the storm's winds becoming sharper, colder, biting through the very fabric of her being. "No. No, no, no," Jenna gasped, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. She tried to pull Luke with her, but he resisted, his body cold and stiff. His eyes were glassy, and he whispered in that strange voice again, "It has been waiting for us, waiting for me." Jenna's vision blurred. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She could feel her knees giving way beneath her, but something held her up. Some force was pushing her forward, toward the archway. The figures had stopped moving, now standing perfectly still, their eyes locked onto her. The rain poured heavier, drowning out every sound except for the crackling growl that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. The storm's growl. The mountain's growl. "You belong to it now," the voice hissed, and Jenna realized this wasn't just a physical place. This wasn't just a storm. This was an ancient force, a living being tied to the mountain, tied to the earth itself. The storm was its breath, its voice, and the mountain was its prison, its home. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, but she gripped Luke harder. "I won't let you go," she said, her voice a soft whisper, the words falling like a prayer. The creature nearest her laughed, the sound crackling like dead leaves underfoot. "She's already lost," it said, its voice filled with an unmistakable glee. "It already knows her. It knows all of you. Your souls are already marked." Jenna's breath caught in her throat as the truth of those words sank in. This wasn't just about survival. It was about something else. It was about the price of leaving, the price of escaping. The mountain wasn't just trying to claim them physically. It was after their very souls, their essences. It had drawn them. It waited for the right moment to strike, and now it would consume them. All of them. All of them. And the storm, it wasn't a storm at all. The storm was the manifestation of the mountain's hunger, its insatiable need to feed. It had called them here, one by one, using their fears, their desires, their very weaknesses. The figure stepped, forward again, and this time, its long, bony hand reached out, brushing against Jenna's cheek. It was cold, colder than the storm itself. She gasped, shuddering as the touch sent ice through her veins. "We are all that remains," the creature whispered, its voice too soft, too insistent. "We are the last remnants of a forgotten world. The storm is but the echo of what we once were, and you will join us." The terror clawed at Jenna's chest, suffocating her. There was no escape. There was no way out of this. But then something inside her snapped. A surge of desperate clarity cut through the fog of fear, and she understood. The mountain had been waiting for them all along, and it was feeding off their fear, their hopelessness. It thrived on the belief that they couldn't escape, that they were trapped in its web. But maybe, just maybe, they could still fight it. Jenna's grip tightened on Luke's arm. "I won't let it take you," she whispered fiercely. The wind picked up again, howling like a wild animal as the storm's intensity surged. But this time, there was something different about it. It wasn't just the storm. It was a battle, the forces of nature clawing against each other. And at the center of it all stood Jenna, her mind swirling with fear and determination. The figure that had spoken before stepped closer, its voice sharp and commanding. "You think you can fight it? You cannot fight what you are. You have already given yourself." But Jenna felt a rush of defiance, something deeper than the terror that had paralyzed her earlier. She could feel the pull of the stone archway, yes, she could feel the pull of the storm. But she also felt something else, a flicker of resistance deep in her core. A spark that refused to let go. "I won't give in," she whispered. She turned away from the archway, from the mountain's dark heart. And as she did, the storm seemed to recoil, the figures faltering as if confused. The air around her shifted, something pulling at the very fabric of reality itself. And then, with a sudden, impossible burst of energy, the storm screamed. But this time, it wasn't a sound of victory. It was a scream of rage. The figures lunged toward her. The storm erupted. For a split second, the world seemed to crack open, and then a deafening howl filled the air, like the roar of an ancient beast awakening after centuries of slumber. The ground trembled violently beneath Jenna's feet, and the very air around her seemed to warp as if the fabric of reality itself was being torn apart. She felt as if she was standing at the edge of something vast, something terrifying, and she wasn't sure if it was the storm or her own fear that made her legs buckle. The figures, those twisted, unnatural creatures, moved swiftly toward her, their long limbs reaching, their glowing eyes fixed with a hunger that chilled her to the core. They weren't just following her, they were closing in, encircling her, trapping her between the stone archway and the dark abyss of the mountain. Jenna's breath came in ragged gasps. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to run, but the weight of the storm pressed against her chest, pushing her deeper into despair. "You cannot escape," the creature closest to her rasped. Its voice was ancient, drenched in 1,000 years of sorrow and hunger. "The storm is not a punishment. It is a gift, a release." The air thickened with something malevolent, a suffocating pressure that felt like 100 eyes watching her, waiting for her to make a choice, a decision. Jenna's hands trembled as she gripped Luke's arm, her mind racing. What could she do? What could anyone do in the face of something so ancient, so overwhelming? Luke, still lost in the trance, spoke again in that hollow, unnatural voice. "It nay is the end, Jenna. It was always meant to be the end." The words hit her like a physical blow, but beneath that cold fear, a flicker of defiance sparked within her. It wasn't just the mountain that was alive, it was the storm too. The storm wasn't a passive force. It was the heartbeat of something far darker, and she had to destroy it, or die trying. The figure in front of her raised its arm, long fingers stretching, reaching out for her like a skeletal hand. But then something unexpected happened. The storm, which had been deafening silent for only a heartbeat, suddenly screamed, a sound that ripped through the very air. The temperature dropped, and for a fleeting moment the world around her seemed to stand still, frozen in time. The wind howled louder than ever, shaking the trees and filling her ears with a piercing shriek. It wasn't just the wind. It was the mountain, screaming in fury, as though it had been wounded. Then, with the force of 1,000 storms, the figures faltered. They stumbled back, recoiling as though burned by an unseen fire. Jenna's heart raced as she saw their forms flicker and shift, like shadows cast in a storm's rage. The storm was reacting to something, and it wasn't just her defiance. It was the fear, the terror, the longing to escape that it fed on. It was that power, that human spirit. The creature closest to her hissed, its mouth gaping wide like a cavern, revealing sharp teeth that gleamed like broken shards of glass. "Foolish girl," it spat, its voice dripping with venom. "You cannot defeat it. The mountain will claim you, just as it has claimed all who came before you." But Jenna's pulse was racing now, not with fear, but with something else, determination. She was no longer just trying to survive. She was fighting for her freedom, for her soul, for every soul that had been trapped here. She had seen the truth of it all. The storm wasn't just a force of nature. It was an ancient living being, and it fed on fear, on despair. And Luke, he had been the key, the first victim of its insidious grasp. "No," she screamed, pulling Luke with all her strength. She wasn't just going to survive this, she was going to end it. With all her might, she pushed him toward the stone archway, her voice trembling but fierce. "I won't let it take you. I won't let it take us." Luke's head snapped up, his eyes briefly focusing on her. For the first time, there was a flicker of recognition. The figure nearest to them lurched forward, trying to grab Luke once more, but Jenna was faster. She shoved him hard toward the archway just as the creatures screamed in unison. The world seemed to shudder, the ground cracking, splitting beneath them as the stone archway pulsed with an eerie, unnatural light. The storm began to spiral around them, its winds whipping violently as if it were alive, clawing at the earth, eager to pull them into its blackened depths. The trees bent and twisted, groaning under the pressure, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. "It's not over," Luke whispered in the voice that wasn't his. "We cannot escape." But Jenna wasn't listening. Her mind was clear now. She understood. The storm was tied to the mountain. It was alive, yes, but it was bound, and it could be undone. In a flash of pure desperation, Jenna threw herself toward the archway, her hands trembling as she grasped the cold stone. She could feel the storm's energy around her, pressing against her, trying to drag her down, to crush her under its weight. Then something clicked, a deep pulse, a crack in the very air. The storm faltered just for a moment, and in that instant Jenna understood. This was no natural disaster. It was a prison built to hold something ancient, something bound to the land, to the mountain itself. The storm screamed, again, this time in agony. The figures surrounding her shrieked in pain as the very ground beneath them began to tremble. The stone archway pulsed with a dark energy, the earth cracking beneath it as if trying to break free of an ancient unseen chain. And then, as the last of the figures lunged toward her, Jenna felt it. A release. The storm's grip loosened, and the figures screamed in fury, vanishing into the darkness of the forest, their forms dissipating like smoke in the wind. The archway cracked open, the light blinding, and the storm, the heart of it all, began to break apart. Luke's body fell to the ground, his limbs slack, his eyes wide, but the eerie, hollow look was gone. His face was his own again. The storm, the ancient force that had held them captive, was fading, retreating back into the mountain's depths. Jenna collapsed to the ground beside him, breathing heavily, her heart pounding in her chest. The rain had stopped. The storm had passed. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was a silence of freedom. But even as the storm faded, the mountains stood tall, unmoving, silent. They had escaped, but at what cost? The wind whispered through the trees, and for a moment, just a brief moment, Jenna felt the eyes of the mountain upon her once more. But this time she wasn't afraid. She had escaped, and the mountain had been silenced. For now, the storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness, but the air still crackled with an unsettling energy. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still slick with moisture, the forest too quiet in its aftermath. The once roaring wind had died down to a faint rustle of leaves, and the sky, although dark, seemed to exhale a deep, exhausted breath. Jenna's breath came in shallow gasps as she helped Luke to his feet, her fingers trembling from the remnants of the terror they had just endured. His body felt light, almost weightless, like he had been drained of everything that had made him him. His eyes were wide, still flickering with confusion, but there was a clarity to them now, a kind of relief that hadn't been there before. He looked at her, and for a brief moment she saw a spark of recognition of the person he had been before the storm had consumed him. Jenna. His voice cracked, hoarse and weak. She nodded quickly, brushing away the hair that had stuck to her face. "It's over, Luke. We're free." But her words felt hollow, empty somehow, as if the very air around them was still suffocating them. She had to believe it was over. They had fought so hard to survive, to escape. But then, as they turned to leave, something tugged at the edges of her mind, something that wouldn't let go. She glanced back toward the mountain, its silhouette looming in the distance like a silent, watching titan. The storm might have receded, but she felt a strange sense of foreboding lingering in the air. A promise that wasn't fully realized. "I think we need to go," she whispered, her voice thick with an odd sense of urgency. The others, though still silent, seemed to feel the same unease. They began walking back toward the trail, trying to put as much distance between themselves and the cursed mountain as possible. But as they moved through the trees, Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The air around them felt too still, too empty, like the world itself was holding its breath. She kept looking over her shoulder, as if expecting to see something lurking behind them, waiting. They walked in silence, the crunch of their footsteps on the wet leaves the only sound breaking the silence. There was no more whispering wind, no more crackling thunder, no more distant screams. But the silence was oppressive, heavy with the weight of what they had just experienced. The woods felt wrong. And then, as they moved deeper into the forest, Luke suddenly stopped, his hand gripping Jenna's arm. She froze, her body instinctively tensing. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know," Luke said, his voice distant, his eyes flicking around the trees as if searching for something. "But it's not over." The hairs on the back of Jenna's neck prickled. She didn't need to ask him what he meant. She could feel it too, the sense of being watched, the familiar tension in the air that had gripped them earlier, back when the mountain had been alive, when the storm had called them in. But they were away from the storm now. They had left it behind. They had to have. "Right? Stop," Luke muttered, his voice shaking. "Listen." At first, Jenna thought he was talking about the wind, but there was something different in his tone, an edge of panic, of recognition. She fell silent, her breath catching in her throat. And there it was, a faint whisper, barely audible, carried on the wind. It sounded far away, but still unmistakable. Their names. Not just theirs, everyone's. "Luke, do you hear that?" Jenna's heart pounded in her chest. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to keep moving, but her feet felt rooted to the ground as though the forest itself was holding her in place. The whispers weren't just distant. They were all around them now, rising from the trees, twisting through the air like threads of smoke, winding their way into their ears. "Jenna, Luke." The voices were growing louder, rising to an impossible crescendo. "They're still calling us," Luke said, his voice shaking with the strain of disbelief. "We haven't escaped. It never wanted us to leave." The realization hit her like a gut punch. The storm had never been the end. The whispers weren't just the wind. They were part of something much deeper, something tied to the very mountain they had tried to flee from. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "No, we're free. We have to be free. But the more she denied it, the louder the whispers became. The mountain's voice, the storm's voice, the mountain's hunger. Luke's face twisted with confusion and terror. What is it? What does it want? The ground beneath their feet trembled again. Not the usual trembling, not the rumble of thunder or the shifting of the wind, but a deeper, darker vibration. Something alive, aware. Jenna turned to look at the others, but they were just as frozen as she was. They could hear it now, the sound of the earth moving, of something stirring, deep beneath the roots of the trees. "It can never let us go," Luke said, his voice barely audible, his eyes filled with terror. The storm, the mountain, it was a trap, and they had never truly escaped it. They had been chosen not for survival, but for something far worse, for a fate worse than death. Jenna could hear the voices now, inside her head, whispering the same words again and again. "You are ours, you are ours, you can never leave." And then, in the distance, something moved, shifted, behind the trees. "It's here," Luke whispered, his voice trembling with pure terror. Jenna didn't look. She couldn't. Her heart was in her throat, her body frozen in place. She could feel the weight of the mountain pressing against her chest, as if it were pulling her back, dragging her into the darkness that had claimed so many before them. Figure appeared through the trees, its silhouette barely visible in the gloom, its shape too large, too wrong. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it were studying them, waiting for them to acknowledge its presence. She could feel its eyes, hundreds of eyes, watching them, pricking at the back of her skull like invisible needles. It was not a human form. It was a shifting mass, dark and flickering, half seen in the shadows. But the whispers did not stop. They swelled, filling her mind, suffocating her thoughts. Jenna's legs shook, her mind screaming for escape, but she knew now, with horrifying clarity, that there would be no running. There would be no escape. The storm had never truly been banished. The mountain had not let them go. It had only waited, and it was waiting still. The figure emerged fully from the trees, its shape grotesque and shifting, as if it were made of shadow and mist, too fluid to be real. Jenna could see its eyes now, dozens of them, all staring at her with a single focused intensity. They were hollow, infinite, pools of pale light that flickered like dying stars, swirling as though each one had a life of its own. The air grew colder, thicker. The silence was unbearable, oppressive. And then the whispers, the voices, took on a more insistent tone, rising in a maddening crescendo. "You are ours," they repeated over and over, each word more suffocating than the last. Jenna could feel the weight of them, pressing against her chest, invading her thoughts, drowning her. She tried to breathe, but the air was thick with something. That made it hard to swallow, as if the world itself had thickened, become unnatural, wrong. Every part of her screamed to move, to run, but her body felt trapped, rooted to the ground, as though the very earth beneath her had wrapped itself around her feet, pulling her in. Luke stood beside her, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear, but also something else, a kind of understanding. The same hollow, far-off look from before returned to his gaze. His body trembled, not from cold, but from a deeper terror. It's here," he whispered, his voice distant and ragged. "It is awake, and we're part of it now. We always have been." Jenna's heart pounded as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. Part of it. They had fought to escape, hadn't they? They had crossed the threshold. They had left the storm, the forest, the mountain. It was over. Or was it? The creature that had emerged from the shadows moved slowly, as if savoring their fear, watching them with those unblinking eyes. Its form shimmered and distorted in the mist, like smoke coiling and shifting around itself. It was too vast, too enormous for her mind to fully comprehend. It loomed in front of them, its form a blur of shifting shapes, jagged limbs that reached into the air, and endless eyes that seemed to take in everything. The mountain, the storm, their very souls. The ground trembled again, this time more violently, like a deep, resonant growl from the core of the earth itself. A pulse, the heartbeat of the mountain, the heartbeat of the storm. Jenna could feel it now. It wasn't just the mountain's ancient hunger that she felt. It was their hunger, the hunger of the storm. She had fought to survive, yes, but what? What if they had never truly left? What if they had been walking into a trap the entire time, bound to this place, bound to the storm's insatiable hunger? The figure, no, the entity shifted, its form becoming clearer, more defined. It was no longer just a collection of eyes and shadows. It had shape now, but it was not human. It was a thing born of the earth, of the mountain itself, a vast, towering presence that seemed to distort the very air around it. Its limbs stretched impossibly long, like dead trees grown from some forgotten forest, and its skin, if you could call it that, was a dark, shifting mass, like the surface of the earth itself, cracked and scarred. "You think you've escaped," it whispered, its voice deep and hollow, like the growl of thunder echoing through the world. "But the mountain is always hungry, and it will never let you go." Jenna's mind reeled. It was speaking to them, not just to her and Luke, but to all of them. This wasn't about escaping. This wasn't about surviving the storm. The storm was only a manifestation, a force of nature that had been set in motion long ago. The true hunger, the true terror, it was the mountain itself. Her thoughts faltered. She understood now. The storm hadn't been an accident. The mountain hadn't been trying to trap them. It had been waiting for them. For generations, it had waited for souls like theirs, those lost to fear, to doubt, to despair. And once it had them, once it touched them, they would be part of it, forever. The creature raised one of its monstrous limbs, its fingers twisting as it reached for them, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You belong to the mountain now," it whispered, the words dripping with an ancient malice. "You are mine." Jenna felt the weight of those words in her bones, felt the invisible chains wrapping around her heart. She fought to breathe, to move, but the more she struggled, the heavier the air grew, suffocating her with the realization that they would never truly be free. The mountain had claimed them, not physically, not as prisoners, but as something more fundamental. They were part of it. Their souls were etched into its very foundation. Luke's voice cut through the storm's fury. "We can't escape." "We're already part of the storm." Jenna turned to him, her eyes wide with horror. His voice wasn't his own. His eyes, those once vibrant, alive eyes, were now clouded, lost to whatever ancient force had claimed him. He was slipping, falling away into the darkness that had taken hold of him, and she knew then with a deep, cold certainty that there was no bringing him back. But even in her terror, something within her refused to give in. She wasn't ready to surrender. She couldn't. Not now. Not when she understood what was happening. Not when she understood the true nature of their torment. With a burst of willpower, Jenna yanked herself away from the pull of the storm, from the force that tried to claim her. She stumbled backward, her heart racing, her pulse a drumbeat of defiance. "No!" she screamed, her voice shaking with desperation. "I won't be part of it! I won't!" For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The storm stopped its howling, the whispers faltered. The figure before her stilled, its massive form looming over her, watching, waiting. Jenna felt a deep, terrifying truth in her gut. It had always been waiting, but now she had a choice. She didn't know how she could fight it, how she could break free from it. But there was one thing she knew for sure. The storm needed them, more than they needed it. In that instant, Jenna made her choice. She wasn't going to fight the storm, as it had been. She wasn't going to fight the mountain the way they had before. Instead, she did the one thing the mountain would never expect. She turned her back on it. With every ounce of strength she had left, Jenna ran, not away from the mountain but toward it, toward the source of its power, toward the stone archway that had once seemed like a doorway into something dark, something beyond their understanding. And as she crossed the threshold, she felt the storm break. The storm, the hunger, the whispers, they faded. The world went quiet. For a moment she was weightless, free, as if the mountain had let go of her, as if it were pulling away from her. But even in that silence, she knew something deeper. She had not defeated the storm. She had simply disrupted it. And the hunger would return someday. But for now, the mountain had been silenced, the storm had been quieted, and Jenna was free. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. Kyle had been tracking the deer for hours. The Olympic Mountains loomed around him like ancient sentinels, their jagged peaks obscured by mist. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the quiet only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves as he pushed through the underbrush. He had grown accustomed to the solitude, to the rhythm of the forest. But today, something felt different. Something wrong. He had been working in this region for years, cataloguing the wildlife, observing behavior, and studying the delicate ecosystems of the remote wilderness. Yet despite all his time in these woods, Kyle had never seen the forest quite like this. There was a heaviness in the air that clung to him, making his every step feel burdensome. As if the trees themselves were watching him, their twisted branches reaching down like bony fingers, trying to pull him deeper into the woods. His foot caught on something hidden beneath the undergrowth, and he stumbled forward, the thick vegetation tugging at his boots. It was then that he saw it. A shadow in the distance, something out of place amidst the untamed wilderness. It was a structure, small, hidden away behind a wall of trees and ferns. At first, Kyle thought it might be an old ranger's cabin, abandoned and left to rot with the years. But as he drew closer, something about it didn't seem right. It was too isolated, too forgotten. The cabin was small, no more than a single room, with a roof that sagged under the weight of decades. Its dark wooden walls were covered in moss, and the door was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. The surrounding trees formed a dense canopy overhead, blotting out the sky and casting the cabin in an oppressive gloom. Kyle stood at the edge of the clearing, hesitating for a moment, his instincts whispering that this was not a place he should be. But curiosity pushed him forward, as it often did. He nudged the door open with his boot, the rusty hinges protesting with a high-pitched creak. The interior was dim, the air musty with age. There was an eerie stillness to the place, a silence that felt unnatural in the wilderness. The room was sparsely furnished. A rough-hewn table sat in the center, its surface scarred from years of... Two chairs flanked it, one of them tipped over, as if it had been hastily knocked aside. A bed, tucked into the far corner, was draped with a faded quilt that had long since lost its color. But it wasn't the furniture that made Kyle's skin crawl. It was the feeling, the sense that the cabin had been abandoned only moments ago. The table was set for dinner. There were plates, chipped and cracked, resting on the surface, along with tarnished silverware. A thick layer of dust had settled over everything. But the table itself, neat, precise, and untouched, looked like it had been prepared only a short while ago. Kyle stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of life, but there was nothing. No footprints in the dust, no sign of recent activity. Just the strange, unsettling stillness that made his breath quicken. His fingers brushed over the edges of the table, feeling the cold metal of the silverware, the worn edges of the plates. Whoever had set this table had left in a hurry, leaving everything behind. His gaze shifted toward the bed where an old, leather-bound journal lay open. It was the only other item in the room that seemed even remotely out of place. Kyle felt a pull toward it, an inexplicable desire to read what was written inside. He crossed the room, each step heavier than the last, as if the very air was thickening around him. The journal was worn, its cover cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age. Kyle's fingers hesitated over the pages, feeling the weight of the moment, the sensation that he was crossing some invisible threshold. Slowly, he turned the first page. His breath caught in his throat. The handwriting was neat, yet there was something about it that unsettled him. It wasn't the words themselves, no. It was the repetition, the obsession in the strokes of the pen. The same sentence had been written over and over, each one more desperate than the last. It only comes when the rain starts. Kyle frowned. He had expected something more substantial, a diary, a record of experiences, perhaps even a note about the cabin's owner. But this was madness. The sentence was written so many times that the ink had bled through the pages, creating a dark stain at the bottom. It looked like the work of someone who had spent hours, days maybe, writing and rewriting the same words, a mantra, a warning, or perhaps a plea. His mind raced, turning over the implications. What had driven someone to write such a thing? And why was the journal left here untouched for years, as if the owner had abandoned it in haste? A sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin, the trees, outside shaking in response, their branches groaning like the sound of distant whispers. Kyle's breath hitched as the temperature in the room dropped, and a strange feeling of unease crept over him. It was as though the air itself had thickened, become heavier, and the silence deepened, making his heartbeat sound too loud in his chest. He tore his eyes away from the journal and glanced back at the door. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to get out of the cabin and away from whatever dark force lingered in the air. But before he could make a move, the wind howled louder, carrying with it a sharp, metallic tapping sound, distant but unmistakable. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and unnervingly precise. The sound was coming from somewhere deep within the forest, echoing through the trees, and it seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Kyle's blood ran cold. The sound, it didn't belong to any creature he knew. He stepped toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind screamed at him to leave, to forget the journal, the table, the eerie sense of something watching him. But as his hand reached for the door, the tapping grew louder still, now coming from directly outside the cabin just beyond the threshold. A shiver ran down his spine, and he turned, eyes darting toward the window. The rain had started. The first drop hit the window pane, followed by another and then another, until the steady rhythm of the rain became a torrential downpour. The tapping, now a staccato beat, echoed through the trees, sharp and metallic, as if some unseen force was drawing closer. Kyle's chest tightened. His heart hammered in his chest as his mind spun in a frenzy of confusion and dread. The journal's words repeated in his mind. It only comes when the rain starts. What had he walked into? What did it mean? And what was coming for him now that the rain had begun? The tapping grew louder, the sound of it now unmistakably nearby. like a presence lurking just outside the cabin, waiting for the rain to bring it forth. Kyle froze, unable to move, his every instinct telling him to run, but his body refusing to obey. The door behind him seemed impossibly far now, as though the cabin had stretched, trapping him in this strange, suffocating place. The rain continued to fall in torrents, and the tapping grew louder still, each strike vibrating through the walls, through his bones. Then, as if the storm itself had answered his silent prayer, the tapping stopped. A dead silence fell over the forest, and for one brief, awful moment, Kyle felt as though the world had gone still. Too still. And then it came. The door slammed open with a deafening bang. The wind howled, the trees outside bent under the force of the storm, and in that instant Kyle knew he was no longer alone in the cabin. The force of the door slamming open felt like a shockwave, rattling the walls of the cabin and sending a gust of cold air swirling through the room. Kyle's heart lurched in his chest, his pulse hammering in his ears. The tapping stopped, but the silence that followed felt even worse. It was suffocating, as though the air had turned dense, pressing in on him from all sides. The forest outside, the very ground beneath him, all felt like they were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. For a moment he stood frozen, staring at the door, unsure whether the wind had caused it to burst open, or if something else, something far more sinister, had done it. His hand was still resting on the edge of the journal, his fingers trembling. The rain was now coming down in sheets, the downpour so thick that it obscured his view of the forest beyond. The trees outside seemed to lean inward, their branches moving like skeletal arms, grasping for something just out of reach. Kyle's breath hitched as he took a cautious step toward the open door. His boots clicked softly against the wood, the sound unnervingly loud in the dead silence of the cabin. His eyes darted back to the table, still set for dinner, the forgotten meal lingering in the room like an invitation that hadn't been answered. The plates, the silverware, everything was as it had been, as if time itself had paused. But the sense of being watched, of being drawn into something far older and far more dangerous than he could ever understand, was impossible to ignore. He turned back toward the door, half expecting to see nothing, but the tapping had resumed. It was faint at first, like the sound of metal against wood, echoing through the trees, with a rhythm that seemed too deliberate, too purposeful. Each tap was a strike, precise and deliberate, like a clock counting down to some terrible conclusion. Kyle stepped outside, unable to shake the feeling that whatever was waiting for him in the woods was tied to the rain, to the sound of that metallic tapping. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stepped off the porch and into the mud-soaked ground. The rain pelted his face, cold and unrelenting. He squinted through the downpour, trying to make out any shape, any movement in the darkness beyond these clearing. But there was nothing. Nothing except the rhythmic sound of the tapping, louder now, coming from deeper in the forest. His instincts screamed at him to run, to leave the cursed place and never return. But something kept him rooted to the spot, some dark force tugging at his mind, pulling him forward. The journal's warning echoed in his head. It only comes when the rain starts. He looked back at the cabin. It stood there like a sentinel, watching him, its empty windows like hollow eyes. But there was no one inside. Or was there? The tapping intensified. It was no longer just a sound. It had become a presence, a signal, a pulse. The woods were alive with it, as though the very trees were vibrating in time with the noise. Each tap was a breath, a heartbeat. Then, as if summoned by the noise itself, the shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed to move. The trees shifted, their branches bending unnaturally as though something, someone, was slipping through them, unseen but undeniably there. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't make out the figure, But something in the way the shadows moved told him it was not an animal. No, this was something far more deliberate, far more intelligent. He spun around, eyes wide, searching for some sign of movement. The rain pounded down in sheets, blurring his vision, making the world seem surreal, distorted. The tapping persisted, now so close it was as if it were right behind him. His head jerked toward the direction of the sound, toward the woods just beyond the cabin, and he saw it, a flash of metallic light. It was quick, fleeting, like the glint of a knife in the dark. Kyle's heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming for him to flee, to escape the forest. But his legs felt heavy, frozen to the ground. He watched as the flash of light disappeared into the woods, swallowed by the blackness of the trees. But then, just as quickly, it returned. A flicker, another flash. The tapping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, an oppressive stillness that seemed to make the very air thicken around him. It wasn't until the wind picked up again, howling through the trees, that Kyle realized just how quiet the night had become. No rustling, no animal calls, no sound of insects. Just the relentless pounding of the rain and the suffocating weight of the silence. And then he saw it. The thing, whatever it was, stepped into the clearing. At first, it was just a silhouette, a shape that seemed to melt into the darkness. But as it moved closer, the moonlight, filtering through the thick clouds, revealed more of it. Kyle's stomach churned as he took in the sight. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its form long and thin, almost spindly, like a man who had been twisted by some unseen force. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its body seemed to shimmer with something metallic, as though it were cloaked in sheets of rusted iron. The surface of its form gleamed faintly, but not with the sheen of metal. It was more like the dull, flat reflection of a moonless night, and its face. Kyle couldn't make out its features at first. It was obscured by shadows, by the rain, but there was something about it, a wrongness. It was not the face of a person. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, featureless metal, as though it had been forged by something ancient, something that had never known the softness of human expression. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, silent, unmoving, its presence suffocating the air around Kyle, like a weight pressing down on his chest. His mind screamed at him to turn and run, but his legs refused to obey. His heart thundered in his chest as he stared into the blankness of the thing's face, a void that seemed to swallow the world around him. And then it moved. The tapping began again, louder now, coming from all directions, as if the very earth beneath his feet was reverberating with the rhythm of it. The metallic sound, sharp and insistent, filled the air, surrounding him, closing in. The figure raised one long arm, slowly, deliberately. Kyle's blood ran cold. In the crook of its outstretched arm, a weapon gleamed in the rain, a jagged piece of metal, twisted and misshapen. The metallic tapping was coming from this weapon, its sharp edges striking the air like a sickening clock. The thing was drawing nearer, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. Kyle wanted to scream, to shout, but no sound came. His throat was dry, his mouth a desert. The world around him seemed to tilt, spinning out of control as the figure took another step, its eerie metallic steps sinking into the wet earth. The rain dripped from its twisted form, as though it were made from the very essence of the storm. And then, in the space between heartbeats, it spoke. A voice that was not a voice, a hiss, a whisper. It slithered into his ears, cold and harsh, its words clear and chilling. It has begun. The rain fell harder. Kyle's legs finally moved, but it was too late. The words echoed in Kyle's ears like a chilling refrain. It has begun. His body froze, rooted to the ground, as the metallic figure's shadow stretched toward him. He was paralyzed, gripped by an overwhelming sense of inevitability. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to get away from whatever horror had manifested before him, but the rain and the oppressive weight of the figure's presence held him in place like a puppet on strings. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, so thick it felt as though the very air had grown heavier, pressing against him. His heart hammered in his chest, his breath shallow, but still, the figure didn't move. At least not in the way Kyle expected. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to study him, as if evaluating whether he was worth the attention it had already given him. And then, it did something unexpected. With a sharp metallic scrape, the figure withdrew its arm. The jagged piece of twisted metal still clutched tightly in its hand. The air hummed with an unsettling vibration as it stepped back, retreating just enough for Kyle to finally tear his eyes away from the figure and glance around the clearing. His heart was pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The woods were eerily silent now, as though holding its collective breath, waiting for something to happen. Kyle's mind reeled, confusion and terror blending together in a swirling storm of thoughts. He didn't understand what was happening, why the figure had stepped back, why it hadn't attacked him right away. The rain soaked him to the bone, and his legs were still trembling with fear, but he couldn't look away from the space where the figure had stood. His gaze darted back to the cabin, its door still hanging wide open, the flickering glow of the storm-scorched woods dancing across its decaying wooden walls. That was when the journal caught his eye again. It was lying back, in the corner of the cabin where he had left it. The leather cover, weathered and worn with age, seemed to almost beckon him back inside the cabin. Kyle's mind was struggling to make sense of the madness unfolding in front of him. The figure, the tapping, it all felt like some twisted nightmare, something that he should wake up from. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized the one thread that had tied everything together. The journal. In the moment of terror and confusion, the words written inside had become his only clue. It only comes when the rain starts. That was the only certainty he had, the only thing that felt tangible in the whirlwind of strange events. But what did it mean? What was the it that had come when the rain began? His hands shaking, Kyle stumbled back toward the cabin, the damp wood beneath his feet creaking as if the very earth was groaning beneath the weight of the storm. The tapping resumed, softer now, distant, but still rhythmic. He entered the cabin, each step feeling more like a forced march into the heart of something he couldn't understand. The air inside was cooler than it had been before, the oppressive atmosphere thickening. He moved cautiously to the bed, where the journal lay open, its pages now turned halfway, the ink still fresh and heavy with the weight of its warning. Without thinking, Kyle reached down and grabbed it, his fingers trembling as they brushed over the faded pages. The journal's leather cover was cracked and brittle in his hands, but it felt almost warm, like it was alive, pulsing with some unseen energy. Turning the pages again, he found the same sentence written again and again, scrawled across the yellowing paper. It only comes when the rain starts. The words stared back at him like a riddle that refused to be solved. Kyle scanned the pages, hoping for something more, something that would shed light on what was happening to him. What was happening to this place? But it wasn't just the repetitive warning that haunted him now. There was something else, something strange. As he flipped through the pages, he found that the ink wasn't uniform. Some of the words appeared darker, more desperate. The letters, shaking and uneven, like they had been written in a frantic frenzy. And then, toward the last pages, there was something different. The words shifted. They became jagged, almost illegible, but Kyle could make out parts of the final entry. It waits in the dark, beneath the trees. When the rain begins, it comes for you. When it has you, you become a part of it. The tapping is its voice. It never stops. The blood drained from Kyle's face as his eyes moved over the words, his heart sinking. The tapping, the figure, the rain. It wasn't just a manifestation of some supernatural force, it was something more insidious. It was part of a cycle, a pattern. The journal wasn't just a record of someone's descent into madness, it was a warning. A warning of what would happen if the rain fell, if the tapping began. A rush of cold dread shot through Kyle as he realized the truth. Whoever had written this journal had experienced it firsthand. They had encountered whatever force had come with the rain, and they had written this account in a desperate attempt to understand it, or perhaps to prevent others from meeting the same fate. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just trapped in this cursed place. He was part of a story that had been written long before he ever arrived. He had walked into something ancient, something that had waited for years, perhaps centuries, to be discovered again. A sound broke through his thoughts, soft, distant. The tapping was back. It was louder now, closer, rhythmic, relentless. Kyle's breath quickened and he stood frozen, the journal still clutched tightly in his hands. His thoughts raced. He needed to get out. He needed to leave before the tapping grew louder, before the thing he had already seen, the figure, returned. But something held him back. The journal was his only link to understanding what was happening, to understanding the force that haunted the woods. He had to know more. He had to understand why it had come for him. He ran his fingers over the pages again, desperate to find anything that would give him an edge, anything that would tell him how to stop it. But the final pages were filled with cryptic phrases, strange drawings, and more desperate warnings. At the very end, the last sentence was scrawled in bold letters, as if it had been written with a great deal of urgency. It takes the form of the rain. It takes the form of the trees. But when it touches you, you become it. You will never be free. Kyle slammed the journal shut, a tremor of fear rippling through him. The tapping was now unmistakably close, coming from just beyond the cabin's threshold. His pulse thundered in his ears as he turned toward the door, his mind fighting against the urge to flee, to run away from whatever nightmare was creeping toward him. The rain was still pouring outside, and with it, the shadow of the figure loomed just beyond the clearing. The tapping, rhythmic and insistent, grew louder. Each strike of metal against metal echoed through the cabin, vibrating the very walls. And then, in the midst of that deafening silence, Kyle heard something else. A voice, soft, almost imperceptible, at first, but clear as day. "It's too late, Kyle." The figure stepped into view, its metallic limbs gleaming in the rain-soaked darkness, its unblinking face now fully visible, watching him with an unsettling, hollow gaze. The voice echoed through the cabin, a whisper so low that Kyle felt it reverberate in the very marrow of his bones. "It's too late, Kyle." The words weren't just spoken, they were felt, a cold pressure pressing against his chest, suffocating him. He staggered back, his legs weak beneath him, as the metallic figure slowly advanced into the cabin. The tapping, which had been distant moments ago, now seemed to pulse with every beat of his racing heart. Kyle's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, trying to grasp onto any shred of logic in the chaos that had consumed him. The journal's warnings, the strange figure, the tapping. It was all connected, all part of something that had been waiting, festering, in the darkness of these woods for far too long. The rain outside seemed to intensify, pounding against the cabin like 1,000 unseen fists, each drop a hammer driving the horror deeper into Kyle's soul. The figure did not speak again. It simply moved closer, its long limbs bending unnaturally as it glided across the room, its metallic body gleaming in the flickering light of the storm. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were empty, smooth metal, reflecting nothing but the darkness around it. Yet Kyle could feel the weight of its gaze, as if it were not merely watching him but studying him, analyzing him, as though it knew every secret buried deep in his mind. He wanted to run. His instinct screamed at him to flee, to escape the suffocating grip of the figure's presence. But his body refused to obey. Every step he took toward the door felt like it was in slow motion, as if some invisible force was holding him in place. The tapping intensified, each strike like a countdown, as though the rain was urging the figure forward, urging it to claim him. Then the figure's arm shot out. It wasn't a natural movement, it was jerky, like something trying to mimic the motions of life but failing at it. The long, spindly fingers reached out toward him with an eerie fluidity that made Kyle's blood run cold. He backed away, his heart thundering in his chest as the figure drew closer, the distance between them closing with agonizing slowness. "No," Kyle whispered, the words choking in his throat. The fear was overwhelming, all-consuming. It threatened to drown him. The figure stopped just inches from him, its presence filling every corner of the cabin. The tapping, once a distant echo, was now deafening, vibrating through the walls of the room, through his very bones. For a moment, everything went still. The tapping ceased, the wind outside died down, and the rain slowed, as if the entire world had momentarily held its breath. Kyle's eyes were locked on the figure. He couldn't look away, couldn't tear his gaze from its empty, soulless face. He could feel the weight of its presence pressing in on him, like the rain itself had become an oppressive force that surrounded him, ready to consume him. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't like a human voice, it wasn't even really a voice. It was more like a sound that vibrated directly inside his mind, bypassing his ears altogether. The words were slow, deliberate, as if the figure was savoring each syllable, taking its time with the torment it was about to inflict. "You are part of it now." The words sank into Kyle's consciousness, digging deep like claws scraping against his brain. His chest tightened, and for a moment he felt as if the very air had been sucked from the room. He gasped, trying to breathe, but his lungs felt heavy, suffocated. His hands gripped the journal tighter, as though it were the only thing tethering him to some form of reality. The tapping began again, but this time, it wasn't just a rhythmic sound. It was like the tapping was coming from within him, as though it had taken root inside his own mind, echoing through his thoughts. The rain outside began to beat harder against the cabin, each drop a violent strike, like nature itself was part of the terrible ritual unfolding around him. The figure raised, its hand again, its metal fingers flexing, twisting unnaturally. Kyle's breath hitched as he looked down at his own hand, his fingers trembling. Was it his imagination, or did they seem to twitch in time with the figure's motions? His pulse quickened as he realized that the tapping wasn't just an external noise. It was part of something deeper, something more invasive. And then, in the thick silence that followed, Kyle saw something that made his blood freeze. A faint glow, barely noticeable at first, appeared in the figure's chest. It was a soft, pulsing light like the beat of a heart. But there was something terribly wrong about it. It wasn't a natural light, not the warm glow of a living creature. No, this light was cold, mechanical, like the inner workings of something ancient and forgotten. The light flickered in time with the tapping, matching its rhythm as if they were one and the same. Kyle's mind screamed, but his mouth was dry, words lodged in his throat like stone. The rain outside intensified, the wind whipping around the cabin, causing the trees to sway violently. The figure seemed to grow taller in the light of the storm, its metal body stretching, twisting with an unnatural grace. And then, with a sudden and jarring movement, the figure's arm lunged forward, grabbing Kyle by the wrist. The touch was ice cold, like metal that had been left out in the snow for centuries. His heart skipped a beat as he tried to pull away, but the figure's grip was unyielding, unbreakable. "You belong to the rain now," the figure whispered inside his mind, its voice sharp and invasive. Kyle felt the words wrap around him like chains, tightening with every breath he took. "You are part of the rain. You are part of the tapping." A wave of nausea crashed over him as his vision blurred. His body felt heavy, numb, as though the very essence of the world had begun to drain out of him, replaced with something cold, metallic and foreign. He looked down at his hand again. His fingers, they were changing. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, but unmistakably. His skin was losing its warmth, its softness. It was turning a dull, metallic grey, the flesh hardening as if it were being covered by some strange, unyielding armor. The tapping continued in his mind, each beat louder, closer, until it was all-consuming. The rain outside was deafening now, the sound of it like 1,000 hammers striking the earth, matching the rhythm of the tapping inside his skull. Kyle fought to breathe, fought to move, but his limbs felt heavy, stiff, as though they were no longer entirely his. His heartbeat drummed in his ears, but even that sound was being drowned out by the relentless tapping. The figure took a step back, and for the first time since it had entered the cabin, Kyle was able to pull in a shaky breath. The pressure in his chest was lessening, but the weight of what was happening to him, what he was becoming, was unbearable. The figure spoke again, its voice now a low hum in his mind, vibrating through his very being. "It will not stop. Not until you are one of us." Kyle stumbled back, his legs nearly giving way beneath him. He looked around wildly, desperate for some escape, some way out of this nightmare. But the rain, the tapping, the figure, it was all connected. There was no escaping it. Suddenly, the figure's arm extended toward him once more. This time, there was no hesitation. The figure reached inside him, its fingers cold as they wrapped around his heart, its touch like a vice. "You will walk with us," the voice in his mind said. "You will never be free again." And in that moment, Kyle understood. The rain hadn't just started, it had called to him. It had always been waiting, and now it had claimed him. Kyle's body trembled violently, a wave of cold rushing through him, as though every drop of blood in his veins had been replaced with ice. He gasped for air, but it felt as though the very atmosphere had thickened, pressing down on him, forcing the breath from his lungs. The figure's touch, cold and unrelenting, gripped his heart, and the realization crashed over him like a violent wave. He was becoming a part of it, just as the journal had warned. He was becoming one with the rain, one with the tapping, trapped in a cycle he could never escape. The figure's fingers dug deeper into his chest, and Kyle's vision blurred as his body felt like it was falling apart. He tried to scream, but the words were lost in the abyss, swallowed by the rising pressure inside him. The tapping was deafening now, a relentless pulse, like the world itself was being drawn into its rhythm. The figure's grip tightened, and Kyle felt the last vestiges of his humanity slipping away, drowning in the metallic cold that was consuming him. The tapping echoed louder and louder until it felt like it was all around him, inside him, filling every corner of his mind. His limbs stiffened, his body contorting as it slowly transformed. He could feel the metal creeping up his arm, snaking down his neck, consuming him from the inside out. But then, in the midst of his overwhelming fear and helplessness, a sudden thought pierced through the fog of his terror. The search team, they were supposed to meet him here. They had arrived with him yesterday, hadn't they? They must have gone looking for him when he didn't return. They were out there somewhere. If they were to find him, find this place, maybe they could help. Maybe they could break this cycle. The tapping around him was deafening now, but something in Kyle's mind snapped. He fought against the figure's grip, pushing against the cold metal fingers wrapped around his heart. His thoughts were fractured, but there was one thread of clarity that remained. He had to warn them. His legs buckled beneath him as the figure's grip slackened for just a moment. He collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, his body aching, his senses reeling. The figure moved slowly, watching him, studying him, its metallic body gleaming in the dim light that filtered through the cabin's cracked walls. Kyle's head spun, but he could still hear the rhythmic tapping in his mind. The figure didn't speak, but Kyle could feel it. The awareness that it was waiting, anticipating his next move, ready to finish what it had started. With a great effort, Kyle pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest as the metallic changes continued to spread, slow and agonizing. He stumbled toward the door, his hands gripping the frame as his legs quaked beneath him. The rain. It had started again, heavier now, thundering down in torrents, washing away the world beyond the cabin. The tapping grew louder, almost deafening now, as if the sound itself were calling to him, drawing him back into the forest where it had all begun. The rain. It has begun. Kyle whispered hoarsely to himself, his voice weak. His vision swam, but he pushed forward, forcing his body to move despite the pain. Every step felt like a battle, every movement like dragging himself through thick mud. Outside, the forest seemed to close in on him, the trees dark and foreboding, their twisted branches reaching out as though they were alive, hungry. The tapping grew louder still, like an impending storm. Kyle's feet moved without him thinking, driven by the thought of the search team, of finding them before it was too late. He staggered into the clearing, the wet earth slick beneath his boots. The rain soaked him instantly, the cold drops biting against his skin like needles. But as he pushed forward into the forest, he began to feel something else, something different. The trees seemed to shift, the shadows around him growing darker, more oppressive, like they were closing in, suffocating him. The tapping intensified, echoing through the woods as though it were coming from every direction, vibrating through the very ground beneath his feet. Kyle's mind screamed for him to move faster to find the team. He tried to push through the thick foliage, but the air felt thicker now, heavier. Every step was a struggle. His body, halfway transformed, felt like it was no longer fully his. His skin itched as though the metal beneath it was expanding, spreading. Suddenly, he stopped. In the distance, just beyond the trees, he saw them, figures moving through the forest. The search team. His heart pounded in his chest, a brief flicker of hope igniting in his fading consciousness. They were here. They were real. They could help. They had to. But as he began to move toward them, the figures shifted, their movements jerky and unnatural. It was as if they were being pulled, drawn into the very rhythm of the tapping, as though they were moving in sync with the unnatural beat of the forest itself. Kyle's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. They were not the search team. They were part of it now. The figures grew closer, their movements more erratic, the tapping louder, now coming from each of them. The sound was like a chorus of metal striking against stone, a cacophony of synchronized footsteps, their bodies twisting unnaturally with each step. "No," Kyle whispered, his voice hoarse, the last shred of his hope evaporating like smoke. They were already lost. They had already been taken, but the tapping didn't stop. It never stopped. The figures came closer until Kyle could see them clearly. Their faces were no longer human, just smooth, featureless metal like the figure that had claimed him. They were covered in patches of the same dark, dull metal that had been creeping up his own body. They weren't alive. They were part of it. Kyle stumbled back, his legs trembling, but he couldn't run. The tapping echoed through his mind, a rhythm that was now inside him, pulling him closer to the figures. They were becoming one with the tapping, one with the rain. And now it was too late for him. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the sound, drowned out by the tapping and the relentless storm. The figures surrounded him, their movements mechanical, deliberate. The tapping grew louder still, until it was all he could hear. And then, with a sudden jolt, the rain intensified, the world around him fading to black. The tapping, the rain, the figures, they all became one. The rhythm, the heartbeat of the forest was inescapable. Kyle was no longer Kyle. He was part of it. He was part of the tapping, part of the rain, and the cycle would begin again. The tapping did not cease. It resonated through Kyle's mind, a relentless, pulsating beat that drowned out every other thought, every shred of resistance. The rhythmic sound echoed within him, vibrating his very bones as if the entire forest was alive with it. His body trembled, his muscles twitching as the transformation took another step, his skin now fully covered in the cold, metallic sheen of the rain's touch. He was no longer the man who had entered the woods. He was something else entirely. Part of it, a cog in the mechanism that was both ancient and eternal. As the figures surrounding him closed in, their movements were eerily synchronized. They circled him, their bodies jerking in time with the tapping that seemed to emanate from everywhere, from within the earth itself. Kyle's mind screamed in desperation, but no sound escaped his lips. His body was no longer his own, nor was it entirely the figures. It was caught in a liminal space, bound to the rhythm, trapped in the cycle of this strange, unspeakable ritual that had stretched across time and forgotten memories. The rain had intensified to a torrential downpour, the weight of it pressing down on the land, drowning everything beneath its relentless waves. The forest, once alive with sounds of wildlife, now stood silent, watching. The trees no longer swayed in the wind. Instead, they seemed frozen, their branches outstretched, pointing toward the figures as though they were offering something, a sacrifice perhaps. The world had become a hushed theater, the only sounds the unyielding tapping and the steady rhythm of the storm. Kyle's chest tightened, his breath shallow, as a thought flitted through his foggy mind. A whisper of a memory, an understanding. Too terrible to bear. The search team. They had arrived, but they were already part of this place. They had been taken, transformed, just as he was being transformed. They had come to help, but they were now part of the same thing that had claimed the forest and the rain. The same thing that had existed long before human feet had ever touched the land. The tapping seemed to shift, its pace quickening, a crescendo building in the very fabric of reality. Kyle's vision began to swim, everything around him blurring as the metal coursing through his veins filled his senses with a cold, mechanical clarity. And then, a voice, low and distant, but unmistakably clear, echoed through his mind. It wasn't the figure's voice. No, this was something older, something deeper, buried in the essence of the forest itself. It has always been like this. The rain, the tapping, the cycle. The voice wasn't just speaking to him. It was speaking through him, filling him with knowledge that he could never fully comprehend. But it wasn't necessary to understand, because he already knew. His body, now fully a part of the rhythm, understood what the voice meant. It comes when the rain starts, when the cycle begins. Those who are chosen are taken, transformed, and made one with the tapping. The realization hit him like a physical blow, so sharp and sudden that it nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. The entity, this force, this thing, was not a single being. It was a collective, a manifestation of something far older than the forest itself. It existed within the rain, within the storm, within the rhythm of the tapping. The rain called to it, summoned it, and those who heard the tapping, those who stood within its reach, became part of it. Their forms were reshaped, their humanity lost. and they were absorbed into the endless cycle, doomed to repeat it forever. And Kyle, the moment he had crossed that threshold, had been chosen. Just like the figures that now surrounded him, once human, now transformed into part of the storm, part of the tapping. There was no escaping it, no end to the cycle. You are one of us now, Kyle. You will walk with us. The rain will never stop. It has begun again. The voice, cold and distant, faded from his mind, but the understanding it left behind remained. A cold weight pressing down on his soul. He tried to move, to scream, to fight, but his body betrayed him. He was no longer capable of resisting. The transformation had already taken root, and there was no going back. As the rain continued to pour, the tapping reached its climax, a deafening sound that shook the very ground beneath him. Kyle's vision blurred completely, the world spinning in a whirlwind of grey, the rain, the tapping, the figures, all blending into one. The world was no longer his. He was a part of it now. And in that moment, as his last shred of awareness faded, he understood. The cabin, the figures, the forest, they were all part of it. All of them were just waiting for the rain to begin, waiting for the cycle to start again. The tapping had always been there, in the forest, in the rain, in the trees. It would never stop. It would never end. And now, Kyle was part of it too. The rain continued to fall, drenching the forest, as if it had never ceased, as if it had always been a part of the land. The trees stood silent, their branches reaching toward the sky like twisted fingers, and the tapping, rhythmic and unyielding, pulsed through the forest, through the earth. It was a sound that would never stop. Far off, the clearing where the cabin once stood lay empty, the remnants of its rotting walls long gone. The place had been consumed, absorbed by the storm, and nothing remained but the rhythm of the tapping and the unrelenting rain. No one would ever find the cabin. No one would ever know what had happened to Kyle, or the search team, or anyone else who had dared to venture into the woods. They were all part of it now, trapped in the endless cycle of rain, tapping, and transformation. And so, the cycle continued. The rain would always come, the tapping would never stop, and the forest, ancient and eternal, would wait for the next soul to hear the rhythm and step into the clearing. Days passed since the storm had ravaged the forest. The rain, relentless and heavy, continued to pour, washing away every trace of the cabin and its occupants. The forest, however, had not forgotten. It never forgot. In the quiet aftermath, the place where Kyle had once stood, where the cabin had once been, seemed frozen in time. The trees, twisted and ancient, stood guard like sentinels, their bark slick with the incessant downpour. The tapping, ever present, seemed to reverberate from deep within the forest, like a heartbeat too steady, too deliberate to be ignored. It was a sound that came from no living creature, nothing human, nothing natural, but still, it echoed, through the trees, through the thick fog that had begun to roll in. And yet there was something else, something subtle in the air. A lingering unease, like a thread of dread woven into the very fabric of the world. The forest was no longer just the forest. It was something more, something darker, something alive in a way that no one had ever truly understood. Far off, in the distant town near the edge of the mountains, the locals had heard the stories. Strange disappearances, a town shaken by the sudden absence of anyone who dared to venture too far into the wilderness. They spoke in hushed voices of the old cabin, of the eerie tapping sound that had been growing in intensity over the past few weeks, of the inexplicable storms that had begun to ravage the area with terrifying regularity. But for those who had never ventured too deep into the woods, the whispers were just stories, nothing more than legend, something to pass the time. with to fuel late-night tales around the fire. Yet even so, there was an unease, a slow trickle of dread that seeped through the cracks of their everyday lives. People talked of strange dreams, of waking up in the middle of the night with the unmistakable feeling that something was watching them. Children spoke of seeing shadows move outside their windows, of hearing strange tapping sounds late at night. The tapping that was so soft at first, but now it was louder. It was spreading. But those who tried to explain the tapping or tried to find its source were quickly met with an overwhelming sense of isolation. A feeling that everything they did to understand it only pulled them deeper into the mystery. And so they stayed away, knowing that once the rain began, once the storm rolled in, they were no longer safe. They didn't know how the tapping had started, how the cycle had begun, but they had heard the warnings. From those who survived, from the few who had managed to flee before it was too late. And now, it was Kyle's turn to be part of the forest's secret. Kyle, whose memory had become an echo in the trees, whose name was just another whisper in the wind, his story now part of the endless cycle. The search team had come and gone, their lives and their mission forever lost to the same force that had taken Kyle. And in their place, the forest had grown darker, as though something had been awakened, stirred by the rhythmic tapping. But as the days stretched into weeks, no one dared to speak his name aloud anymore. It was as if the very air refused to carry it. It was forgotten, swallowed by the rain, by the storm. Then one evening, the tapping began to change. At first it was subtle, like a whisper brushing against the leaves. The air felt heavier, as though the storm had not just brought rain, but something else. Something that could touch the edges of your soul and pull at it with a cold, insistent hand. The tapping became more insistent, no longer merely a rhythmic sound in the distance. Now, it was everywhere. It was in the trees. It was in the wind. It was in the very ground beneath their feet. Some of the townsfolk began to hear it too. Late, at night, in the silence between the storm's roar and the wind's howl. They would wake from dreams that felt too real, too tangible. The rain would be pouring outside their windows, and they would hear it. The tapping, faint at first, then louder, clearer, and impossibly close, as if it was inside the walls of their homes. One night, when the wind howled and the storm raged with an intensity that made the very earth tremble, two men, driven by curiosity and the need for answers, set out to find the source of the tapping. They were brave, foolish, some might say, but they didn't know the true nature of what waited for them in the forest. No one had ever truly understood what happened there, except for the ones who had vanished, and they were beyond warning. The two men walked through the forest, their flashlights cutting through the thick fog that clung to the trees like a shroud. The sound of their boots crunching against the wet leaves was drowned out by the now constant tapping, growing louder, with every step they took. It was as if the very forest itself had come alive, responding to their presence with an eerie rhythm, as if it were beckoning them closer. After what felt like hours, they came upon the clearing. The place where the cabin had once stood, where Kyle had disappeared, was now nothing but an empty void, the trees circling around it like silent sentinels. The rain had let up slightly, but the tapping was louder than ever, echoing in their ears. The men looked around nervously, their eyes scanning the trees, the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if something was waiting, lurking, just beyond their vision. But there was nothing there. No sign of the cabin, no remnants of Kyle's journal, nothing except the rhythm that pounded through the forest, insistent and unyielding. One of the men, unable to take the oppressive silence, any longer shouted into the void, "Who's there? What is this?" His voice was immediately swallowed by the night, lost in the rhythmic tapping that now seemed to fill every inch of the forest. But before the second man could speak, the tapping stopped. A chilling stillness fell over the clearing, thicker than the fog itself. Then the trees shook. A sharp crack echoed through the air as the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. And then they saw it. From the fog, from the rain, it rose, slowly at first, like the shadow of a man being formed by the storm itself. The tapping began again, only this time it was synchronized with the movement of the figure, slow, deliberate, like the ticking of a clock winding down. The figure was tall, too tall, and its body shimmered with a metallic sheen, just like Kyle had seen. But there was something different about it now. The surface of its form was scarred, twisted, as if the very act of becoming part of the tapping had reshaped it, had made it something more, something other than human. The men stepped back, their hearts racing, but their feet seemed rooted to the ground. The tapping grew louder, now unmistakably coming from the figure, from the very air around them. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, staring at them with eyes that were no longer eyes, just hollow, empty sockets that reflected only the darkness of the storm. And then, just before it vanished back into the fog, the voice spoke. Again, this time not in Kyle's mind, but in the very air around them. "You are part of it now." The tapping began again, the rhythm growing faster, louder, until it filled every space in their minds. And the forest waited, forever patient, for the next soul to hear the rhythm and come. The forest had swallowed them whole. The two men had disappeared into the darkness, and by the next morning the storm had passed, leaving behind only the soggy remains of the forest. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, but the weight of the humidity hung in the air like a dense fog that made every breath feel heavier. The trees, dark and looming, stood like silent witnesses to the horror that had unfolded the night before. The tapping that had once been distant was now just a memory, like the aftertaste of a nightmare that wouldn't quite fade. No one would speak of what had happened to those men, not aloud. Their absence became just another unsolved mystery in a town already filled with too many of them. Those who knew them most intimately, their families, their friends, searched the woods for days, combing through the trees and the thick underbrush, hoping for something, anything. But there was nothing to find. It was as though the forest had consumed them entirely. No traces, no footprints, no sign of a struggle. They had simply vanished, as if swallowed by the earth itself. Their names would be forgotten like so many before them, whispered only in quiet circles, spoken only when the rain began to fall. Back in the town, whispers turned into nervous glances. People began to avoid the forest altogether. Some still ventured into the outskirts, but no one dared to get too close to the heart of the woods. The tapping had stopped, but something else lingered in the air. A heavy sense of waiting, as if something was watching, listening, waiting for someone to take the next step. The town, once vibrant with life, had grown strangely still. The clockwork rhythm of daily life had faltered, and in its place was an unshakable unease that crept into every crevice of the town. People looked over their shoulders more often. The shadows under the trees seemed deeper. The air felt thicker. The rain returned, but it was no longer just the rain. The storms came faster now, with violent gusts of wind and the eerie sound of something scratching against the trees. People would wake in the middle of the night, the rhythmic tapping seeming to follow them into their dreams. The tapping. Always the tapping. And then came the strange occurrences. At first, it was just a few isolated incidents, missing tools, lost animals, objects out of place. But then, the tapping began again, louder this time, so loud that some claimed they could hear it even inside their homes. The sound echoed through the walls, through the windows, each strike like a hammer against their very bones. It was as if the tapping was everywhere, moving beneath the earth, seeping into their homes, into their very minds. Some claimed to see the figures. They would glimpse them in the corner of their vision, standing motionless under the trees, their metallic forms gleaming in the moonlight. Their faces, if they had faces, were featureless, smooth like the metal of forgotten machines. But no one could ever look at them directly. Every time they turned their heads to catch a better glimpse, the figures were gone, leaving only the memory of their presence, haunting and unshakable. It wasn't long before the disappearances started again. One by one, the town began to lose its people. At first, it was the outsiders, those who came to visit, to see the place for what it had once been. But soon, the locals were taken as well. No one was safe. The search parties grew larger, their desperation more frantic, but every attempt to search deeper into the forest ended in failure. The forest didn't give up its secret so easily. And yet, despite the mounting terror, there were still those who didn't believe. Those who told themselves it was all coincidence, just a string of bad luck. They would venture into the woods, convinced that they could find answers, that they could escape the grip of the tapping, the darkness that seemed to pulse with life beneath the soil. It was always the same. The rain, the tapping, the figures. But no one had ever truly understood what it was, what it wanted. No one could see the full picture, because the figures, the tapping, were part of something older, something that had existed long before the town was ever founded. They had been waiting for the right time to reveal themselves, to pull those who had dared to trespass into their rhythm, into their eternal cycle. It wasn't about revenge or malice. It was simply about the cycle. It always had been. And then, one day, as the last few souls in the town began to pack their belongings and flee into the unknown, a single figure appeared in the heart of the forest. It was different this time, more tangible, more solid, its presence filling the space around it. It stood alone, silent, waiting. Its long, spindly limbs twitched slightly, as if the tapping itself was reverberating through its body. The rain began to fall harder, the rhythm building, quicker now, as if something was preparing to happen. Something that could not be stopped. The figure stood there, staring out toward the town that had once been so full of life. Now, it was empty. The last of its inhabitants had fled, leaving behind only the remnants of a forgotten place. The figure took a step forward, its body creaking, groaning, as though it were made of something other than flesh, something mechanical, something ancient. The tapping grew faster, louder. As it moved, it passed through the abandoned streets of the town, its figure casting long shadows in the misty rain. The tapping, relentless and unstoppable, rang out like a bell, announcing its presence to whatever remained of the world. The figure moved closer to the edge of the forest, toward the place where the cabin had once stood. It was no longer there, but the ground still bore the imprint of what had been, and as it stood in the center of the clearing, the rain fell in sheets, the tapping a constant hum in the background. The figure raised its head to the sky, its hollow face staring at the darkened clouds above. It was waiting for the rain to start once more. The rhythm would never end. The cycle would never break. It had always been this way. And it would always be this way. And deep within the forest, beneath the soil and the roots, the tapping began again. The tapping, a relentless, steady beat, filled the air, growing louder, more insistent, as if the very earth itself was reverberating with it. The rhythm seemed to pulse from the center of the forest, from the place where the cabin had once stood. The rain had softened, but the dampness in the air was thick, stifling. The sound of it, so mechanical, so precise, seemed to echo through every tree, every branch, every leaf. It was the heartbeat of the forest, the beating of something that was both alive and dead, something that had existed long before anyone had dared to enter its depths. The figure stood motionless at the clearing, its tall, twisted form silhouetted against the mist that clung to the trees. It had become one with the forest, its movements sharp, mechanical, its body gleaming with the cold sheen of rusted metal. Its hollow eyes, smooth and featureless, seemed to gaze out over the land it had claimed, as if it were waiting for something, waiting for someone. And then, without warning, it moved. The tapping quickened, the sound now resonating in every direction, vibrating through the ground beneath its feet. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, its limbs clicking and creaking, with each movement as though the very act of walking was something unnatural, something broken. The air grew colder with each step, and the fog seemed to curl around it, like the forest itself was recoiling at the presence of the figure. The once lush woods, full of life and noise, were now quiet, unnervingly still. Only the tapping remained, echoing louder as the figure moved closer to the edge of the clearing. As the figure neared the trees, it stopped. Its gaze shifted downward, and in the fog something shifted in the distance. A shape, a shadow, moving silently through the undergrowth. At first it was difficult to make out, just a blur of motion, but then it became clear. A figure, a person, alone. Kyle's heart skipped a beat as he saw the figure standing in the distance, his breath catching in his throat. It was him, or at least, it looked like him. The man standing before the figure was Kyle, or what had once been Kyle. His body was no longer entirely human. His limbs were twisted, his once warm skin now covered with the same metallic sheen that had consumed him. In the cabin, his face, if it could still be called a face, was hollow, smooth, devoid of expression, with only a faint reflection of the moonlight bouncing off its surface. The tapping, now deafening in its intensity, seemed to emanate from him, from the very core of his being. It was as if the rhythm had become part of him, as if it had always been part of him. Kyle, or whatever he had become, raised his head slowly, his hollow gaze meeting the figure standing at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, they simply stared at one another as if the world had stopped spinning, as if everything had been suspended in this one terrible moment. The wind shifted, and the tapping grew louder still, vibrating the very air around them. And then, as if pulled by some unseen force, Kyle began to move toward the figure, his movements stiff and jerky, as if he were struggling against his own body, against the rhythm that now controlled him. The ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse in time with the tapping, the earth itself shifting and trembling as though it were preparing for something. The figure did not move as Kyle approached. It simply stood there, its body unnaturally still, waiting. And when Kyle reached it, he stopped, standing just a few feet away, his body trembling as if it was no longer his own. The tapping, relentless and unyielding, seemed to reverberate inside Kyle's skull, drowning out everything else. The figure raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, its long, twisted fingers reaching toward Kyle. And in that moment, the air seemed to freeze, the world holding its breath as the figure's fingers brushed against Kyle's chest. The touch was cold, impossibly cold, and as the figure's hand made contact, the tapping grew louder, faster, until it seemed to drown out everything else. Kyle's body jerked violently, a harsh mechanical shudder rippling through him as the transformation reached its final horrific stage. His limbs twisted and contorted, his skin cracking and shifting as the metal coursed through him like a tide. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He couldn't scream. The rhythm had swallowed him whole, and now there was nothing left. And then, with a final, brutal motion, the figure's hand pressed firmly into Kyle's chest, and the tapping stopped. For one long, dreadful moment, there was nothing. Silence. The forest, the trees, the rain, all of it seemed to pause, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting. And then the tapping began again, only this time it was different. It wasn't just a sound, it was a voice that resonated not just in the air, but inside Kyle's mind, inside his very soul. "Welcome back," the voice said, the words slow and deliberate, each syllable like a heavy hammer striking his consciousness. "You have returned to the rhythm. You are part of it now." The sound of the tapping merged with the voice, becoming one, a single unbreakable force, and Kyle could feel the rhythm running through him, pulsing in every inch of his being. He was no longer an individual, no longer a man with a name. He was a part of the forest, a part of the tapping. The cycle had begun again, and now he was the one waiting for the next soul to hear the rhythm, to come closer, to step into the forest where the rain would start again. The tapping continued. It would never stop. The forest had become a living thing. Its roots stretched deep into the earth, pulling from the darkness beneath, while its branches reached high into the rain-soaked sky. The trees whispered, though no one could hear their voices. No one, except those who had been chosen. And now there were more of them. More than just Kyle, more than the town's lost souls. The tapping had claimed them all, and with each new soul, the forest grew stronger, more alive, more twisted. Kyle, or whatever remained of him, stood motionless beneath the dark canopy of trees. His once human form had been swallowed by the rhythm, his flesh now nothing more than a patchwork of rusted metal and shifting shadows. His limbs were long and thin, his joints creaking with every slow movement. His face, what could be seen of it, was a hollow reflection of the man he had once been, but those hollow eyes were now filled with the rhythm. The tapping pulsed through him, as it did all the others, echoing within every fiber of his being. Around him, the figures stood as well. Souls long lost to the tapping, transformed into something not quite human. They were all silent, motionless, as if waiting for the moment when they too would carry the rhythm forward. The forest had claimed them, and in turn they had become the forest, their bodies twisted into unnatural shapes, faces smoothed of all emotion. They were the forest's pulse, the forest's heartbeat. For a moment, Kyle felt something stir within him, a faint memory, a whisper of what had once been, a fleeting image of his life before the tapping, before the cabin. He could almost remember the sound of his own name, the warmth of the sunlight on his skin. But the rhythm, the tapping, drowned it out. It filled him, consumed him, his body, his mind. Everything had become one with the forest. And now, the tapping was all he could hear. He raised his head toward the sky, his senses attuned to the faint, distant sound of rain beginning to fall once again. The forest shifted with it. The leaves rustled. The air grew thick with anticipation. The rhythm, though ever present, began to pick up speed, its resonance vibrating through the very air. It was time. The cycle was beginning again. Through the mist, through the growing fog that seemed to bleed from the earth itself, the figures began to move. Slowly at first, like something awakening from a long sleep. Their limbs twisted unnaturally, jerking as the tapping took hold. The air buzzed with their movements, each step a discordant note in the symphony of the storm. They moved with purpose, their eyes fixed on the clearing where the cabin had once stood. The rhythm surged louder now, faster, as if it were calling to them, urging them forward. The figures, those who had once been human, were now the embodiment of the tapping, each step pulling them deeper into the forest, into the rhythm that had claimed them all. And Kyle, now one of them, followed. He could feel the pull, the irresistible draw toward the center of the cycle, toward the heart of the forest where the tapping had first begun. His feet moved without thought, as if the forest itself guided him. The rain began to pour harder, the rhythm of it blending with the tapping, creating a haunting melody that echoed through the trees. The forest seemed to come alive, its dark branches swaying as though they were reaching out, embracing the figures as they approached. The earth beneath their feet hummed with energy, a low, vibrating sound that matched the beating rhythm within their souls. They had been chosen. They were part of the cycle. They had become the forest's heartbeat, the rain's pulse, the tapping's unyielding march. And then, as the figures reached the clearing where the cabin had once stood, something happened. The ground trembled beneath them, the air vibrating with an intensity that was almost too much to bear. The tapping, no longer just a sound, but a force, shifted. It was no longer just the rhythm of the forest, the pulse of the rain. It had become something greater, something darker. It had begun to evolve. Kyle felt it first. The rhythm, once steady, began to warp, to twist, becoming something unrecognizable. The tapping, once a mere pattern, now felt like a force being shaped, bent into a new form. It was no longer just the forest. It was the tapping. It was the rain. It was the very essence of the cycle, drawing everything into its singular, unbroken pulse. And then the ground cracked. A jagged fissure split open in the earth, stretching wide and deep. From within, a cold light began to glow, faint at first, but growing brighter with each passing second. The tapping, once a rhythm, now began to take shape, its form becoming clearer, its presence more defined. The figures, those who had once been human, moved toward the crack, as though they were drawn to it, compelled to step closer to whatever had emerged. Kyle felt the pull, too, the urge to follow them, to draw nearer to the crack in the earth where the tapping was coming from. It was calling to him, to all of them. It was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, a force, a thing older than the forest itself, older than the world they had once known. As Kyle stepped forward, his limbs now moving without his command, he saw it. Rising from the depths of the earth, a form began to take shape, a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body writhing with metallic tendrils that hummed with the rhythm of the tapping. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a void, an endless blackness that reflected nothing. From its body, the tapping emerged, its rhythmic strikes reverberating like the beating of a heart that had been beating long before Kyle had ever stepped into these woods. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't a voice. It wasn't something heard. It was something felt. A deep vibration in Kyle's chest, in his bones, as though the words were being imprinted directly into his soul. The cycle is complete. You are now part of the rhythm. Forever. The forest seemed to pulse with life, its ancient trees groaning under the weight of the tapping that had now consumed everything. The figures stood in a perfect circle around the entity, their forms flickering in and out of focus. Their bodies, now one with the rhythm, Kyle standing among them, felt it. The last shred of his humanity faded as the tapping, the rhythm, became all-consuming. It was inside him, inside every fiber of his being, vibrating through him. He was no longer Kyle. He was part of something much older. He was part of the forest. He was part of the tapping. He was part of the eternal cycle that would never end. The earth rumbled as the figure, whatever it was, pulled its metallic tendrils from the ground, its shape flickering in the storm's mist. The tapping grew louder, faster, a crescendo that filled every inch of the clearing, every inch of Kyle's mind. The cycle had begun again. And now, there was no turning back. As the rain fell harder, the tapping continued, unrelenting, eternal. And Kyle, along with all the others, was lost in the rhythm, forever. The rain continued to pour, a steady, unbroken deluge that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. The forest, heavy with the weight of the storm, was quiet save for the rhythmic tapping, which had become the heartbeat of the land. It resonated in the trees, in the very earth beneath their feet, filling every inch of the clearing with a sound that was both ancient and unyielding. Kyle's body stood motionless, a part of the ever-growing circle of figures who had long since lost their identities, consumed by the rhythm, consumed by the tapping. His once human features were now obscured by the same metallic sheen that covered the others. His body had been reshaped, twisted into something unrecognizable, but still he could feel the faintest remnants of what he had once been. The tapping echoed through him, through every fiber of his being. He could hear it, feel it, as though it was a part of his very soul. The rhythmic sound pulsed through his veins, through his mind. It was inescapable. It was everywhere. And as the last traces of his humanity faded, Kyle understood. There was no longer any escape. He had become part of the forest, part of the rhythm, part of the tapping. The figure that had emerged from the earth, the entity whose form flickered between darkness and metal, loomed over them all. Its presence was suffocating, overwhelming. It was the source of the tapping. It was the pulse of the earth itself, the heart of the forest, and the embodiment of the storm that had claimed them all. The entity's form twisted, undulating like liquid metal, tendrils of shadow weaving in and out of its body. Its hollow eyes, if they could be called eyes, stared out over the gathering, taking in the figures around it. They were no longer individuals. They were no longer human. They were part of it now. They were part of the cycle, bound to it, unable to escape. As Kyle stood in the center of the clearing, his body no longer his own, he felt the tug of something deep within him. A pulse, a vibration in the very core of his being. The tapping, once distant, now consumed him entirely. He could no longer tell where his thoughts ended and the rhythm began. The lines between his humanity and the entity had blurred, and with each passing second, he felt himself slip further away from what he had been. He was a part of it now. The tapping was his heartbeat, the rhythm was his mind, the storm was his soul, and then something shifted. Something changed. The tapping, once a steady, rhythmic pulse, began to falter. The beats became uneven, disjointed. It was as though the very pulse of the forest had started to unravel. The air, once thick with the sound of the tapping, grew still, heavy, with an unnatural silence. The rain, which had fallen relentlessly, began to slow, its rhythm now at odds with the eerie quiet that hung in the air. Kyle felt it first. A deep unease, a trembling beneath the surface of the rhythm. The tapping had changed. The steady, unyielding beat had faltered, and with it, something else stirred, something ancient, something darker. The figures around him, those who had once been human, began to move, their metallic bodies shifting in an unnatural way. They twitched and jerked as though the rhythm that had once controlled them was now slipping through their fingers, like water through a cracked vessel. Kyle's own body trembled as the sense of dread grew deeper, colder. The tapping, no longer synchronized, became erratic, frantic. The earth beneath them groaned, the trees shaking as if in response to a growing force, something pushing against the very fabric of the cycle. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone, a storm unlike any other brewing in the distance. The entity, once still, now began to move. Its form flickered in the mist, becoming more defined, more corporeal with each passing second. Its tendrils, made of dark metal and shadow, lashed out, their movements chaotic, as though the rhythm it had once controlled was now escaping its grasp. The tapping, which had been the heartbeat of the forest, began to falter once again, growing weaker. A low hum, almost imperceptible at first, rose from the ground. It was a sound that felt wrong, as though something was unraveling at the very core of the forest itself. It echoed through the trees, through the figures, through Kyle's body, and then, with a sudden, violent burst, the tapping ceased. Silence. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, the forest was still. The rain stopped falling, the wind ceased howling, and the rhythmic beat that had consumed them all fell silent. The figures, once moving in time with the tapping, froze. Their bodies, no longer controlled by the rhythm, stood motionless, like statues carved from metal and shadow. Kyle's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow as he tried to make sense of what had happened. The world felt wrong. The air was thick with a heavy, unnatural stillness that hung over everything. The forest, once alive with the pulse of the tapping, now seemed empty. The cycle had been broken, but there was something else, something deeper. A presence, something that had been waiting, watching from the shadows. And now it was moving. From the depths of the forest, from the crack in the earth where the tapping had emerged, something stirred. A new sound, deep and low, rumbled through the air, vibrating the very earth beneath their feet. It was not the rhythmic tapping they had come to know. It was something darker, something older. The forest seemed to react to the sound, its branches trembling, the ground shaking beneath them. The figure that had once stood at the center of the clearing, the entity, flickered once more, its form shifting and changing as though it was struggling to maintain its shape. It writhed, twisted, as though the very fabric of its existence was being torn apart by the new force that had awakened. And then a voice. A deep, ancient voice, not in Kyle's mind, but from the very heart of the forest. You cannot break the cycle. It has always been. It will always be. The tapping, though now quiet, resumed in the distance, like the pulse of the earth calling to them, pulling them back into the cycle. The figures, their bodies still twisted and deformed, began to move again, their limbs jerking unnaturally. But this time, their movements were different. Their eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, seemed to flicker with a faint, desperate awareness. Kyle felt it too. The tug, the pull of the rhythm, the call to return. He was no longer Kyle. He was part of it now. Part of the tapping, part of the cycle. There was no escaping it. The forest had become something else. It had become a prison. And now, the cycle was starting once again. The tapping had returned. The silence lingered, a thick, oppressive blanket over the forest. The tapping, once erratic and disjointed, had returned to its steady, rhythmic pulse, but something was different. It was no longer just the heartbeat of the forest. It was now an all-consuming force that seemed to reverberate in every corner of the world around them. The figures, twisted and broken, moved once more. But this time, they moved with purpose. Their metallic limbs clicked and scraped, the sound as sharp and hollow as the emptiness in their eyes. Kyle, standing at the center of the clearing, felt it. The tug, the pulse, pulling him towards something deeper within the earth, beneath the roots of the ancient trees. The tapping had become a part of him. The rhythm flowed through his veins like fire, and with each beat, he felt himself slipping further into its grasp. The awareness of who he had once been, the man who had stumbled into the woods, the man who had been consumed by the cabin, was fading. Now, he was just part of the cycle. He was part of the tapping, part of the forest's endless pulse. And yet, there was something more. Something beneath the tapping. A deeper vibration that seemed to resonate in the very core of the earth itself. The figures, like Kyle, were drawn to it, moving in unison toward the crack that had once been the source of the entity, the place where the tapping had first emerged. They walked with an eerie synchronicity, each step measured, deliberate, as if they were part of a grand design, a pattern too old to be understood. As they reached the center of the clearing, the ground beneath them trembled. A deep, low rumble echoed through the air, and the earth split further. From the fissure, a cold, almost blinding light began to pulse. The forest around them seemed to shudder in response, its trees bending toward the light, their branches creaking with a strange, unnatural energy. The tapping intensified, quickening with every passing second, as if something was pushing it forward, urging it to reach its final inevitable conclusion. The air was thick with the sound, the rhythm vibrating through the very bones of the world. Kyle stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the crack, his body trembling as the light grew brighter, more intense. His senses were overwhelmed by the sound, the eye tapping, the rhythm, the pulse that filled his entire being. It was no longer just a part of him. It was him. It was everything. The crack in the earth widened, and from within it, a figure began to emerge. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form flickering between shadow and light. Its body shimmered with the same metallic sheen that covered the figures around it, but it was different. It was more solid, more defined. It radiated power, an ancient, unknowable power that seemed to stretch out toward the edges of the forest. As it rose from the depths of the earth, the tapping became deafening. It wasn't just the sound of metal against wood anymore. It was the sound of the world itself being remade, reshaped, reborn. The rhythm of the tapping was no longer a mere beat. It was a call, a summons, a command. The figure towered over the forest. Its face, if it could be called a face, was an abyss, a void that reflected nothing but the endless black of the universe. It stared down at the figures gathered before it, its hollow gaze cold and unfeeling. "You have returned," the figure's voice echoed, not through sound, but through the very air itself, vibrating through the bodies of those gathered before it. The voice was ancient, deep, impossibly old, as though it had been spoken by the earth itself, by the roots of the trees, by the mountains that stretched beyond the horizon. Kyle felt it inside of him. The presence, the power. The tapping was louder now, rushing through him, and he could feel himself unraveling, each beat tearing away the last remnants of his humanity. He was becoming part of it. He was becoming part of the tapping. He was becoming part of the earth itself. "You are all part of the cycle now," the figure continued, its voice like the rumble of thunder, deep and unyielding. "You have come to me, and now you will serve the rhythm. The tapping will never end. It will always call to those who hear it." The ground trembled again as the figure's form shifted, its tendrils of shadow and metal reaching out like long, twisted arms. They wrapped around the figures, pulling them in, binding them to the rhythm, to the cycle. One by one, the figures stepped forward, their bodies jerking and twitching as the tapping overwhelmed them, as it had overwhelmed Kyle. And then the figure turned its gaze toward him. Kyle's body tensed, but he could not move. The tapping inside him surged, a wave of power that flooded every inch of his being. His skin felt like it was burning, his body twisted by the rhythm, reshaped by the tapping. He could feel the cycle in his bones now, in his blood. It was him. It was everything. The figure reached toward him, its long metal fingers curling around his chest. The tapping grew louder still, the sound reverberating in his mind, in his soul. Kyle's body screamed, but no sound came. He could not escape. He could not run from it. "You are mine," the figure whispered, its voice like the crackle of thunder. "You are part of the tapping. Forever." Kyle's body jerked violently as the rhythm surged inside him. His limbs twisted, his joints snapped, and his body began to shift, to warp. The metallic sheen spread further, crawling up his neck, over his face until his entire body was consumed by the rhythm. And as the tapping reached its final, all-consuming crescendo, the forest seemed to explode with energy. The trees shuddered, their bark splitting as if the very air was tearing them apart. The ground cracked wide open, and the earth trembled as though it were giving birth to something new. The tapping, the rhythm, the pulse. It was the heart of the world now, the heartbeat of the forest, the storm, the cycle that could never be broken. And as Kyle's final thought faded away, as the last shred of his humanity was consumed by the tapping, he understood. There was no escape. The tapping would never stop, the cycle would never end. The forest was alive in ways that words could never fully capture. The trees, their trunks twisted and gnarled, seemed to pulse with energy, their roots digging deeper into the earth, stretching farther than they had ever reached before. And the wind, though absent now, left an eerie, unnatural stillness in its wake. The rain had stopped falling, yet the air was thick with moisture, suffocating and heavy, as though the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. And in the heart of the forest, where the tapping had begun, where the rhythm had taken hold, the cycle reached its final, tragic culmination. The entity that had risen from the depths of the earth stood tall, its form a blend of shadow and metal, its massive tendrils of darkness, weaving in and out of itself like a living nightmare. Its face, or the void where a face should have been, stared out at the forest and the figures it had claimed. It was no longer just a force of nature. It was the embodiment of the cycle itself, the rain, the tapping, the endless rhythm. It was now, and had always been, the heart of the forest, the keeper of the pulse that had consumed everything it touched. The figures that had once been human now stood in formation, their bodies bent, twisted by the rhythm that controlled them. Each of them, once a soul, once a person with thoughts and desires, was now an extension of the cycle, their eyes vacant and hollow, their limbs jerking with the tapping, the heartbeat of the earth. Their minds were gone, swallowed by the relentless force that had overtaken them. They no longer knew who they had once been. They only knew the rhythm. They only knew the pulse. Kyle stood at the center of it all, his body shuddering with the force of the tapping inside him, his limbs twitching, his mind swirling in the darkness. He was no longer himself. He was no longer a man. He was a part of the cycle, a vessel through which the tapping, the rhythm, would continue forever. He could feel the last vestiges of his humanity slipping away, being replaced by something darker, something primal, something far older than he could comprehend. The tapping had become his essence, the rhythm his soul. And as he stood in the heart of the forest, surrounded by the hollowed figures, he knew there would be no turning back. The entity, its voice, a deep rumbling sound that resonated in every corner of his being, spoke again. "It is done," it said. Its words were not spoken, but felt, vibrating through the earth, through the air, through the very fabric of reality. The rhythm is complete. The cycle will begin anew, and you, Kyle, are its keeper. His body trembled as the entity's words filled him. The tapping surged inside him, rising in intensity, becoming something that consumed every part of him. He could feel the pulse in his chest, in his veins, in his bones. It was the rhythm. It was everything. And now it was him. For a moment, there was nothing but the tapping, nothing but the rhythm of the earth, the heartbeat of the forest. Time seemed to stretch, to bend, as if the very fabric of existence was tied to that sound, to that pulse. And then, from the corner of his mind, a thought emerged, a fleeting fragment of clarity, a memory, a moment of weakness, a crack in the rhythm. Was this what he had wanted? The thought was like a whisper, faint and fragile, a reminder of who he had once been. Kyle could still remember the feeling of sunlight on his skin, the cool breeze against his face, the fleeting sense of freedom that had come before the tapping, before the rhythm had taken hold. It was fleeting. It was gone. His body jerked again, pulled back into the rhythm, the pulse. The tapping surged, and the memory faded. He was nothing more than an instrument of the cycle now, a part of the eternal rhythm that could never be broken. The entity, sensing his brief moment of rebellion, spoke again, its voice cold and final. "You are no longer Kyle. You are part of the rhythm. There is no escape. You belong to the forest now. You belong to me." The tapping grew louder, filling every corner of his mind. The rhythmic strikes of metal against wood were no longer just sounds. They were feelings, sensations. They were his very existence. The forest had claimed him. The tapping had claimed him. He was no longer the man who had stumbled into this place. He was part of the force that had always existed in the shadows, in the forgotten corners of the earth. But even as the rhythm consumed him, something deep within him stirred. The part of him that was still Kyle, still human, pushed back. It was weak, it was dying, but it was still there. It fought against the force that had swallowed him, against the tapping that had rewritten his very soul. It was too late. The rhythm had already taken hold. The tapping had already claimed him. The cycle had already begun. And yet, for one brief moment, he remembered. He remembered the world outside the forest, the world beyond the tapping, the world that had once felt so vibrant and alive. It was gone now, but he remembered it, and that memory, though fleeting, was enough. As the tapping surged one final time, as the rhythm reached its peak and the forest trembled with its intensity, something broke. The earth shook, the trees groaned, and the figures that had once been human staggered, their bodies jerking in time with the relentless pulse. But then, in the heart of the clearing, the cycle paused. For the briefest of moments, the tapping stopped. The figures froze, the forest stood still, and in that silence, Kyle's final thought echoed one last time. It's over. But it wasn't over. The tapping began again.